The wind moves like a whisper through the thatched roofs of a forgotten medieval village. It carries the scent of damp straw, wood smoke, and earth turned cold by the breath of approaching winter. Hearth fires burn low behind wooden shutters, their smoke curling into a darkening sky. Somewhere, far off, a church bell tolls slow, hollow, and tired. The sound drifts across the fields and through the fog like a warning, or perhaps a reminder. This is the night between October 31st and November 1st, when the living whisper about the dead. There are no glowing pumpkins here, no strings of lights or children dressed as ghosts demanding candy. There are no plastic skeletons, no laughter echoing down the streets. The medieval Halloween, or what would later become it, was quieter, older, and infinitely darker. In this world, fear wasn't for fun, it was faith. The people of these small villages believed that tonight, the boundary between worlds grew thin enough for souls to wander the good, the wicked, and everything in between. Long before anyone spoke of Halloween, there was Samhain, the ancient Celtic festival marking the end of the harvest and the start of winter. The Celts believed that as the final crops were gathered and the year's warmth faded, the wall between life and death wavered. Fires were lit on the hills to protect against the spirits, and offerings of bread and milk were left outside for those who roamed in the dark. The air was heavy with superstition and gratitude, a strange sacred balance between fear and reverence. But centuries passed, and the church came marching north. Christianity spread its candles across the pagan dusk, and the old gods were slowly renamed, replaced, or forgotten. Samhain became All Hallows' Eve, the night before All Saints' Day. The priests told the villagers not to fear the dead but to pray for them. Still, old habits lingered like smoke. Beneath the Latin hymns and the tolling bells, the ancient fires of Samhain still smoldered in secret. Families still whispered to the night, still lit candles for unseen guests, still believed that something or someone was walking among them. It wasn't a night of candy or carved pumpkins. It was a night of watchfulness, of doors barred and prayers whispered. Outside, wolves howled at the edge of the fields. Inside, families gathered around the hearth, telling stories of spirits who refused to rest, of travelers who vanished in the mist, of the dead who knocked politely before entering. It was said that to ignore them was to invite misfortune, and so even the most faithful Christian left a little bread by the door just in case. In this world, Halloween was not a celebration of fright, but a negotiation with it. The villagers did not dress up as monsters to play at fear. They disguised themselves to hide from it. They did not seek candy, they sought mercy. For in the Middle Ages, life itself was fragile, and death was never far away. So tonight, we drift backward through smoke, through time, through the faint shimmer of the old world. We'll wander through candlelit chapels and misty fields, through the echo of chants and the crackle of dying fires. This is the real Halloween, the one born of faith and fire, of fear and hope, when the veil between worlds grew thin, and every shadow felt alive. If you enjoy these slow journeys through forgotten nights, remember to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And tell us in the comments what you'd offer a wandering spirit if it knocked on your door tonight. Now, settle in. The wind is rising, the fire is low, and the past is about to begin again. The last echoes of the bell fade into the mist, and the village settles into uneasy quiet. Inside the small chapel, the priest whispers his Latin prayers beneath a wooden cross. Outside, the villagers are gathering wood. It is the end of October, the edge of autumn, and though the church calls it All Hallows' Eve, the people still remember another name, Samhain. The priest doesn't say it, of course. He's been told not to. But he knows that when the sun disappears, when the wind begins to howl through the hedges, every house in the valley will light a fire. They will call it a blessing, a ward against evil. But he knows, and they know, that it's older than any Christian prayer. For centuries before the church came, this night belonged to the Celts. Samhain, summer's end, was their final turning of the year, the moment when the warmth of life slipped away and the cold of death crept in. They believed that the world of the living and the world of the dead lay side by side, and that on this night the thin veil between them dissolved. The dead could wander freely, visiting homes, demanding offerings, whispering to the living through the wind. When Christianity arrived in the north, it found these fires burning wild, defiant, beautiful. The church saw the fear that flickered in those flames, but also the faith hiding inside it. And like it did so many times throughout history, it decided not to destroy, but to reshape. In the 9th century, Pope Gregory IV declared November 1st as All Saints' Day, a day to honor the holy dead, the saints who had triumphed over darkness. Later, November 2nd became All Souls' Day, to remember the ordinary departed, the mothers, fathers, and children still waiting in purgatory. Together, these days formed a bridge, a Christian echo of Samhain, baptized in holy water but still haunted by old smoke. It was a clever move, a kind of spiritual diplomacy. Instead of forbidding the ancient fire festival, the church rebranded it. The villagers could still light their fires, but now they would say it was to honor the saints. They could still leave bread and milk outside, but now it was for the souls in purgatory, not for wandering spirits. The prayers changed. The meaning did not. But the villagers were not theologians. They didn't see the difference between a ghost and a soul, between a pagan offering and a Christian prayer. To them, the world was one continuous mystery, half light and half dark. The church gave them new words, but the old fears still lingered in their bones. So on the last night of October, after the priest finished his sermon and retreated to his rectory, the people returned to their hills and hearths. They piled wood high and struck sparks into the night. The bonfires roared, their smoke swirling toward the stars, their heat licking the cold air. Around them, villagers sang hymns and whispered charms, some from the Bible, some from their grandmothers. The old and the new mingled like smoke and incense. To keep the spirits warm, they said, as they fed logs into the flames, and to keep them away. It was a strange kind of kindness. That fire, part offering, part warning. They did not wish to anger the dead, but they did not want them too close either. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, staring into the glow, half hoping to see something move, half praying they wouldn't. Above them, the stars flickered faintly, hidden by smoke. The land felt alive, every rustle in the hedgerow, every crackle of fire seemed to belong to some invisible presence. Dogs barked at shadows. The wind carried voices that might have been nothing more than branches, or something far older. And through it all, the church bells tolled again, slow and solemn, a reminder that this night belonged to God now. But even the bells seemed unsure which world they were calling to. Across the centuries, that uneasy marriage between faiths would define medieval Halloween. Christianity had claimed the date, but not the soul of the festival. The villagers prayed for saints by day and feared spirits by night. They confessed their sins in the morning and whispered charms before sleep. They walked between two worlds, much like the souls they honored. The priests did their best to guide them. They held vigils in the churchyard, lighting candles on the graves of the faithful. They preached of resurrection and salvation, of heaven's bright gates and purgatory's fires. Yet even as they spoke, the faint orange glow of distant bonfires shimmered through the fog beyond the church walls. The people still trusted the fire more than sermons. It was visible, warm, alive. A chronicler from the 12th century once wrote that the peasants still kindle their hilltop fires on All Hallows' Eve, saying they drive away the devils, though they are told these are superstitions of the pagans. But no amount of preaching could fully erase the memory of fear. After all, fear was the oldest religion of all. To the medieval mind, the world was not divided between sacred and sinful. It was all one trembling mystery. Fire could purify, but it could also invite. Spirits could bless or curse. Saints might protect, but they could also punish. And so, when the villagers looked into the firelight, they saw not contradiction, but truth. This was the night when the two faiths, old and new, burned side by side. The flickering bonfire was the center of everything. Around it, they told stories of the dead who lingered too long, of knights cursed for breaking vows, of maidens who wandered the moors, waiting for forgiveness. Each story was a warning. Remember your dead, or they will remember you. In the distance, the faint hum of monks chanting drifted from the church, low, rhythmic, eternal. It mixed with the laughter of children and the crackle of burning wood. The living prayed, and the dead, or what they imagined of the dead, listened. Perhaps that is why the fires burned through the night, long after the prayers were done. They were not just for protection, they were for memory, for warmth in a world that was mostly cold, for the illusion, however fragile, that light could hold back what waited in the dark. And when dawn came gray and cold, smelling of ash, the villagers crossed themselves and went to Mass. The priest spoke of the saints, the martyrs, the holy dead. The people nodded solemnly. But when they returned home, they buried the fire's ashes in their fields, just as their ancestors had done. For blessing, they said, and for luck. It was the same old prayer, wrapped in new words. The church had given the people a calendar, a reason to pray, and a name for the night. But deep inside, beneath the hymns and incense, the old rhythm still beat on. The rhythm of fire and frost, of death and harvest, of fear and reverence. Even centuries later, when the last traces of pagan belief had faded, the bonfires remained. They became harvest fires, vigil fires, remembrance fires. They survived because people still needed them, not just to warm their hands, but to comfort their hearts. In truth, the medieval Halloween was never about choosing between pagan or Christian, between superstition or salvation. It was about balance between the warmth of the fire and the chill of the grave, between the living and the dead, between the faith that promised heaven and the instinct that still feared the dark. And perhaps that is why, even now, when children carve pumpkins and light candles in smiling faces, something ancient still stirs beneath it all. Something older than candy or costume, older than saints or sermons. It is the memory of a fire burning on a hill, of people standing close together in the cold, whispering the same prayer their ancestors whispered. May the dead find warmth. May the living be left in peace. The words have changed over time, but the need has not. For no matter how much light we invent, every October we still feel that old pull, the quiet truth that this world and the next are closer than we think. And so, as the 1st of November dawns and the bonfires fade into ash, the medieval villagers step into the new day, believing they have done their part. They have prayed, they have burned, they have remembered. The saints will watch over them now, the souls will rest, and the fields perhaps will be kind next year. But when night falls again, and the mist returns, they will glance toward the hills where the ashes lie, and wonder if the spirits truly sleep. For in the medieval world, the dead never really left, they merely waited for the next fire to be lit. By the time twilight fell over the medieval hills, the last trace of sunlight had already surrendered to the creeping cold. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet earth, and the fields stripped bare after harvest glimmered faintly with frost. In the distance, a faint glow trembled on the horizon. One fire, then another, and another until the hills themselves seemed to breathe with light. These were not small hearth fires, nor the secret sparks of peasants hiding old gods beneath Christian names. These were bonfires, vast, living things, built by entire villages, rising taller than a man. They blazed against the endless night, like defiance made visible, like prayer given form. To the medieval mind, the world was always teetering between life and darkness, order and chaos. Fire, then, was not just warmth, it was survival. It was faith that glowed in the face of winter. Villagers gathered around the flames in silence at first, their faces drawn in the flickering light. The youngest carried torches made from bundled reeds, while the elders leaned on sticks, muttering blessings older than the Latin prayers that now ruled the church. Some crossed themselves, others whispered words that no priest had ever spoken. The world might have changed, but the fire remembered. It had begun as a pagan ritual, long before there were kings or cathedrals. The Celts had kindled their Samhain fires on high ground so that the gods might see their devotion and, more practically, so that the villages below could see each other's flames and know they were not alone in the dark. By the Middle Ages, the church had given these fires new meanings: holy vigils, purifying lights, lamps for the souls in purgatory. Yet the old instincts remained. The bonfire was a meeting place of belief and necessity. It was part ceremony, part superstition, part survival strategy. Winter meant hunger, sickness, and isolation. The fire meant warmth, protection, and community, a fragile shield against what everyone feared most: being forgotten by both God and the living. Before the blaze reached its full fury, the villagers would lead their cattle, the lifeblood of every household, through the smoke. The beasts shuffled nervously, their hides glistening in the dim light, their breath steaming in the cold air. The people believed that the smoke would cleanse them, driving out sickness and evil spirits before winter took hold. It was half blessing, half insurance. Children watched, wide-eyed, as the animals disappeared into the mist of heat and ash. The air was thick, choking, but sacred. When the cattle emerged on the other side, they were considered safe, marked by the fire, purified by the gods, or by the saints, depending on who you asked. No one questioned the ritual's logic. In a world ruled by famine and fever, hope was as precious as grain. When the last of the animals had passed through, the villagers turned their attention to the fire itself. Men with soot-streaked faces fed it branches, straw, and dried herbs. The flames rose higher, bending in the wind, crackling with a sound that almost resembled a voice. Some claimed that if you listened closely enough, you could hear the whispers of the dead ancestors calling from the other side, answering the prayers of the living. Women threw bundles of grain into the fire, murmuring for good harvests next year. Young lovers tossed handfuls of dried flowers into the flames, each petal a promise whispered to fate. The heat washed over them like a living breath. For a few moments, they forgot the cold, the hunger, the aching uncertainty of life. The fire became everything: a god, a guardian, a messenger between worlds. As the night deepened, songs began to rise. Some were hymns, clumsy and half-remembered. Others were melodies that had no words at all. The firelight made dancers out of everyone. Children laughed and spun in the glow, while old men lifted their hands in silent blessing. Sparks drifted upward like fireflies, disappearing into the stars. And though they might have called it All Hallows' Eve, in truth, it was still Samhain beneath the skin, a moment when the veil between the living and the dead fluttered like a curtain in the wind. The ashes, once the fire burned low, were gathered with reverence. To modern eyes, they might look like nothing: dust, soot, ruin. But to the people of that time, ashes were sacred. They carried the memory of flame, the essence of protection. In the gray light of dawn, villagers scattered them across their fields, whispering old words for luck and fertility. May the earth remember this warmth, one might murmur. May the roots sleep safely beneath it. The ashes settled like fine snow upon the soil, mingling with the last remnants of harvest. It was their way of sowing light into the ground before darkness claimed it. There were other uses too. Some people smeared the ashes on their doorsteps to keep away wandering spirits. Others marked their foreheads with a faint cross of soot, part superstition, part sacrament. The church, seeing the act, tolerated it. Better soot shaped like a cross than symbols of pagan gods, they reasoned. What the priests did not understand was that for most villagers, the meaning was not one or the other, it was both. To them, there was no contradiction between the saints above and the spirits below. Both demanded respect. Both might offer mercy. From hill to hill, the glow of fires stretched for miles, like constellations fallen to earth. Each blaze was a signal to the others. We are alive. We remember. We are not afraid. For one night, scattered communities felt like one people again, joined by flame and fear and fragile hope. Travelers on distant roads could see the bonfires shimmering in the mist and knew they were approaching human company, warmth, and perhaps a bowl of broth or a crust of bread. The fire's language was universal. It spoke to every class and creed. The noble might host his own grand feast in a stone hall, but even there, candles were lit for the dead, and torches flared in the courtyard. The peasant and the priest, the farmer and the monk, all watched the same fire consume the same darkness. As the night waned, the fire grew gentler. The wild orange glow softened into embers. The singing quieted into murmurs. Somewhere, an old woman hummed a lullaby that her grandmother had sung at another Samhain, another lifetime ago. The flames crackled like tired voices answering back. It was said that when the last spark died, the spirits would return to their realm, appeased and comforted. The living would sleep easier, knowing that they had honored their part of the unspoken pact between worlds. But even as the people dispersed, the smoke lingered. It rose in ghostly tendrils through the gray dawn, curling over the fields, clinging to the rafters of cottages. seeping into hair and cloth. For days afterward, the smell of it stayed in the air, a reminder that something sacred had passed through the night. It's hard to overstate what that fire meant to them. In a world without streetlights, without warmth beyond the hearth, without certainty of the next meal, a fire was more than flame, it was civilization itself. It was the oldest friend of humankind, one that could destroy but also protect. For the medieval villager, surrounded by cold earth and endless sky, it was proof that the human spirit could still glow against the dark. Historians later described these bonfires as folk custom, syncretism, or seasonal ritual. But that language feels too neat, too academic. To those who stood around them centuries ago, it was neither religion nor rebellion, it was instinct. A way of saying, we are still here. The fire carried everything they could not say aloud, their fear of winter, their grief for the dead, their prayers for the unborn. In the crackle of the flames, they heard the murmur of the past and the promise of the future. In the dance of sparks, they saw their own fragile souls reflected, brief and bright, burning against eternity. And when the final embers sank into ash and the first light of dawn broke over the hills, the villagers turned toward home. They carried the last coals carefully in clay pots to light their hearths for winter. In some villages, it was forbidden to let the household fire die completely during the cold months. To do so was to invite misfortune. Those coals born from the sacred bonfire were believed to guard the home from illness and loss. Thus, the communal fire became personal. What had begun as a single act of survival on the hill became 1,000 private flames flickering in cottages across the land. The ritual had done its work. It had united, purified, blessed, and divided its warmth among the living. The night had been endured, the dead appeased, the fields consecrated. It is strange, perhaps, that so much hope could rest in something as fleeting as fire. But that was the paradox of the Middle Ages. Everything perished, and yet everything mattered. The fire would die, the ashes would fade, the winter would come, but the memory of warmth, the whisper of light, would stay. And perhaps that was the true miracle of those ancient bonfires, not that they kept away the spirits, or that they pleased the saints, but that they reminded the living that even in the longest dark, there was still something left to kindle. The villagers never said it quite that way, of course. They simply looked at the fading embers and said softly, "It was a good fire." Then they went back to their lives to milk the cows, mend the fences, bury the grain, carrying, in their soot-streaked hands, a piece of the old world's light. It would burn in their hearths. It would burn in their memories. And in some quiet way, it still burns in ours. When the bonfires finally burned low and the villagers returned to their homes, a deep stillness crept across the land, the kind of silence that breathes. Smoke clung to the damp air, winding through hedges and hollow roads like something alive. The sky was moonless, the stars veiled by a milky fog that rolled in from the sea. It was said that on such nights, when the mist grew thick enough to swallow sound, the boundary between the living and the dead thinned until even a whisper could pass through. In the Middle Ages, death was not a distant concept, it was an everyday companion. People lived beside the graves of their ancestors, worked beneath the shadow of the churchyard, and measured time by funerals as often as by festivals. The Black Death had not yet come in full force, but even before it, the medieval world was steeped in mortality. Fevers, famines, childbirth, and war had already made life a fragile and fleeting thing. Every household had its ghosts. Every family had names they still spoke to the dark. To the medieval imagination, the dead did not vanish when buried. They lingered, not quite gone, not yet saved. The church had given that in-between place a name, Purgatorium, the place of purging, where souls waited to be cleansed before entering heaven. It was a mercy, the priest said, but to the people it was a haunting. If the soul could not rest, then surely it must wander. On All Hallows' Eve, when the fires dimmed and the fog thickened, those wandering souls were believed to drift through the night. Some came to ask for prayers, gentle voices calling from the hedgerows, whispering their own names so they would not be forgotten. Others were restless, bitter, or afraid. They had died without confession, without candles, without peace. They sought warmth, forgiveness, or company, whatever the living could give. The villagers did not mock such tales. They feared them. Doors were barred and windows shuttered. Bread and ale were left on thresholds, as offering small tokens to soothe the hungry dead. A few bold souls carried lanterns to the crossroads, placing them there so that wandering spirits might find their way and not lose themselves among the living. The lanterns flickered faintly in the fog, like floating eyes. If a dog barked at midnight, they said it had seen one of the departed. If the wind moaned through the eaves, they said it was the cry of a soul asking for release. Some even claimed to hear footsteps where no man walked soft, dragging sounds moving through the mist. No one looked out to see. To look upon a soul from purgatory was to invite it in. It was not just the poor and the simple who believed. Even monks in their cloisters told of strange sounds in the night. Chroniclers recorded tales of ghostly processions moving across fields at dusk, long lines of pale figures carrying candles, chanting prayers no living tongue could understand. The air was thick with sighs, one scribe wrote, and the mist glowed faintly as though lit by sorrow. Priests taught that the souls of the faithful departed could be aided by the prayers of the living. And so, on All Souls' Eve, bells were rung throughout the night, the ringing of the dead. Each toll was meant to comfort a soul, to guide it toward heaven. But in the lonely villages, far from cathedrals, those bells took on another sound, mournful, haunting, as if the earth itself were grieving. The fog amplified everything. A distant bell became a cry. The rustle of a tree became a sigh. Men walking home from the tavern swore they saw figures in the mist, women in burial shrouds, children clutching candles that never melted. Sometimes they vanished into smoke. Sometimes they turned and smiled with faces that should have been dust. Superstition mixed with faith, and fear became ritual. Some villagers carried sprigs of rowan or yew to ward off spirits. Others burned incense or sprinkled holy water at their doors. But many accepted the haunting as part of life's balance. The dead, after all, had once been living friends, lovers, parents. To acknowledge them was not foolishness. It was respect. In one small hamlet, an old woman named Alfred was known to keep a single candle burning in her window every year on this night. She said it was for her husband, who had drowned when his fishing boat was taken by a storm 20 winters past. She claimed he came back each All Hallows' Eve, not to frighten her, but to rest by the fire before the long journey back to purgatory. The priest frowned upon her story but said nothing. Her candle's light comforted more than it disturbed. For some, the line between haunting and hope was thin indeed. In the great cathedrals, priests chanted masses for the souls of the dead, but in the low cottages of the countryside, families whispered to the empty air, speaking softly, as if to someone sitting beside them. "You are remembered," they said. "You are loved. Rest now." And sometimes, they swore, the house grew warmer after those words, the air stilling, the candle flame steadying as though in gratitude. There were darker tales too, spirits not from purgatory, but from elsewhere, the unshriven, the damned, the restless dead who refused both heaven and hell. It was said they wandered the marshes and the old burial mounds, drawn to the warmth of human breath. Those who met them might fall ill, or dream strange dreams for weeks. Yet even these were pitied. "They seek what they have lost," the villagers murmured. "And who among us does not?" The fog was their cloak. It blurred the edges of the world, made every hill and hedge uncertain. Travelers who dared the roads on such nights often returned pale and trembling, if they returned at all. They spoke of shadowy hands brushing against their sleeves, of whispers that knew their names, of lights flickering just out of reach. The church warned that these were tricks of the devil, but the people were less certain. They had lived too long beside death to see it as purely evil. To them, the dead were not demons. They were memories given shape. And so, the night between October 31st and November 1st became one of both fear and tenderness, a time to remember, to pray, to tremble, and to listen. The fog was not just mist. It was presence. Every breath of it carried history. Every drop of dew that clung to the grass at dawn was said to be a tear shed by the souls who had passed through the night. When the first rooster crowed and the gray light crept back across the fields, the spell of the fog broke. The spirits, it was said, slipped back to purgatory, their time among the living over. The villagers emerged slowly, eyes red from sleeplessness, and crossed themselves before stepping outside. The world felt washed, quiet, strangely light. The bread left on thresholds had gone hard. The candles had burned to stubs. The people said it was enough the spirits had eaten. The souls had found peace, for now. In the church, the priest intoned the names of the dead once more. The villagers knelt, heads bowed, the scent of smoke still clinging to their clothes. They prayed for mercy not only for the departed, but for themselves, who would one day join them. In their minds, heaven and earth were not so far apart. Both were places reached through fog, and as the days shortened and the nights grew colder, that belief stayed with them, the quiet certainty that the world was shared, that the living walked beside unseen company. Every sound in the wind, every flicker of candlelight was a reminder that they were not alone. In time, the great theologians of the church would try to draw sharp lines between superstition and doctrine, between ghosts and souls, between fear and faith. But, for the medieval villager, there was no such divide. Life itself was fragile, uncertain, haunted. To live was to balance constantly between the seen and the unseen. So when the fog returned, as it always did, they did not curse it. They watched it drift through the trees, curling around the stone crosses and the graves. They whispered the old prayers, not because they were certain they worked, but because silence felt too much like abandonment. And in the low hum of their voices, in the steady rhythm of bells, the soft glow of candles, and the ghostly sigh of mist, the world seemed, for a moment, to hold its breath. The fire had been their shield. The ashes had been their offering. But the fog was their reminder that even when light fades, even when warmth dies, something of us lingers, something that waits to be remembered, something that listens in the dark. And on that thin night, when the air trembled with both sorrow and wonder, the living and the dead shared one fragile truth: neither was ever truly gone. They were simply separated by a veil of mist, one that, once a year, grew mercifully thin. When dawn finally broke, the fog lingered like a ghost refusing to leave. The villagers moved slowly through the pale light, their eyes hollow from a sleepless night. Smoke still hung over the fields, mingling with the scent of burnt wood and damp earth. Some said the air felt lighter, as if the spirits had indeed gone back to their rest. Others weren't so sure, and that uncertainty, that quiet, gnawing fear, was something the church could not ignore. By the high Middle Ages, priests had grown weary of the old ways. Year after year, they watched their parishioners light forbidden fires on the hills, whisper to the dead, and leave offerings of bread and milk on their doorsteps. The church had tried to Christianize these customs, to transform Samhain into All Hallows' Eve, to make it a night of prayer rather than of fear. But habit, like shadow, clings to everything. The priests preached that the dead did not wander, that the souls in purgatory could be aided, not appeased. Yet outside the candlelit chapels, the people still spoke to the fog. It was not rebellion, at least not in their eyes. It was instinct. The church told them to pray for the departed. They simply added a crust of bread and a bowl of milk to help the prayer along. What harm could there be in kindness? What priest could forbid comfort to a ghost? And so, each year, the same pattern repeated. Inside the stone walls of the church, light and order. Outside, smoke and silence. The priests would begin their vigils at sunset. Candles were lit one by one along the altar until the nave shimmered in golden light. The flicker of 100 flames made the saints in stained glass appear to breathe. The air was heavy with incense, frankincense for sanctity, myrrh for mourning. Latin chants rolled like waves through the echoing space, deep and unbroken. It was the church's answer to the chaos outside a controlled fire, a holy one. Villagers crowded into the pews, clutching rosaries and muttering prayers. They came barefoot, mud still on their hems, the smell of the fields still on them. Some brought lists of names, fathers, mothers, children, to be read aloud by the priest. Each name was a soul in purgatory, waiting for release. The priest's voice rose and fell in rhythm, solemn as the toll of a bell. Requiem aeternam, dona eis, Domine. Grant them eternal rest, O Lord. Outside, the real bells began to ring. Across the countryside, every steeple echoed with the deep, mournful sound of the passing bell. They rang not for the living, but for the souls who might be listening, for those who still wandered the night. The bells, said the priests, were prayers made of iron, a reminder to the dead that the living remembered them still. The villagers believed something else, that the sound itself kept the darker spirits away. The night was long. Between prayers, the faithful lit vigil candles and left them along the church walls. The light spilled through cracks in the door, casting trembling halos on the fog outside. It was said that each flame represented a soul rising toward heaven. But for many, it was simpler than that. They lit candles because darkness frightened them. When the final prayers ended, the priest would sprinkle holy water across the pews and send the congregation home. His voice was calm, reassuring. Do not fear the souls, my children. They are not lost. They are waiting. Pray for them, and they shall find their way. He believed it, perhaps. Or perhaps he only hoped he did. Because once the villagers left the church, once the doors were barred and the last candle guttered out, he knew what they would do. He knew they would set their small tables near the door and place on them the same simple offerings they always had. A loaf of coarse bread, a bowl of milk, sometimes a little ale. Some even left a wooden spoon beside the bowl, in case the dead had forgotten how to use their hands. The priest disapproved officially, at least. Such things reeked of superstition. But in his heart, he understood. He had buried too many children to tell their mothers not to hope. And so, though he never blessed these offerings, neither did he condemn them. He simply turned his eyes away when he walked the village paths at dawn and saw the crusts half-eaten, the milk disturbed by wind or animal, the dishes moved slightly from where they had been placed. The church's position was delicate. It needed to guide without breaking the fragile faith of the people. Too harsh a hand, and they might slip back into pagan ways altogether. Too lenient, and the line between Christianity and old superstition would vanish completely. And so the priests walked their own narrow path, part shepherd, part diplomat. In towns and monasteries, new customs were encouraged to draw attention away from the forbidden ones. Souling, for instance, the practice of giving small loaves, soul cakes, to beggars and children who promised to pray for the dead. A soul cake for a soul's release, they said. It was the church's clever compromise, a Christian act disguised as charity, a way to turn old offerings into holy ones. But even that practice carried echoes of something older. The beggars, carrying lanterns made from hollowed turnips, went door to door singing, "A soul, a soul, a soul cake. Please, good mistress, a soul cake. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, and 3 for him who made us all." The rhythm of it drifted through the village lanes, mingling with the wind a litany half prayer, half incantation. It pleased the priests to hear it, though they pretended otherwise. For every soul cake given, another superstition was tamed. Yet the church could not touch everything. The countryside was too wide, the night too long. Beyond the reach of bells and sermons, families still practiced their private rituals. They burned herbs to ward off wandering souls. They whispered blessings over wells and crossroads. And always, always, they left something for the dead. In the north, people called it feeding the silence. In the west, they said it was paying the debt of the living. Whatever the words, the meaning was the same. Fear and love are not so different when the night is cold. The priests, for all their power, were human too. In their own rooms, some kept small relics, locks of hair, pieces of cloth from the departed they had once known. They prayed for them privately, long after the official masses were done. They too had dreams of the dead. They too sometimes woke to the sound of footsteps in the fog. In monasteries, the night of All Souls was even more solemn. The monks would chant through the dark hours, voices rising in slow, measured cadence. "Deliver them from the lion's mouth," they sang, "and let the everlasting light shine upon them." The chant was meant to strengthen faith, but in truth, it also soothed fear their own as much as anyone's. Outside, however, the people's fires burned once more, smaller than before, but no less meaningful. Families gathered around their hearths, praying quietly as the embers glowed. They did not see themselves as defying the church. In their minds, they were doing what faith had always done, blending reverence with remembrance. The church gave them prayers. The old gods had given them rituals. Together they kept the darkness at bay. Over the centuries, the church would try again and again to refine the celebration to make it cleaner, holier, more theological. But no decree could truly erase the human heart's need for gesture. Prayers alone felt too thin. People needed something they could touch, light, or taste. Bread, milk, candles, bells, these were prayers with texture. Prayers that reached across the boundary of death in ways words could not. And perhaps that was what the priests came to understand, slowly, reluctantly. Religion may govern the soul, but superstition comforts the body. The villagers needed to feel that their hands could still do something, that they could feed the hungry, even if the hungry were ghosts. By the time midnight came again, the sound of bells had grown softer, the fires lower, the fog began to lift, and the stars returned. The priest stood in the doorway of his chapel, looking out across the quiet fields. He saw faint shapes of cottages, each one with a single candle still burning in the window, tiny lights against the dark. He smiled then, just slightly. Perhaps the people's faith, though tangled in old customs, was stronger than he had believed. Perhaps God accepted their offerings, even when made with trembling hands. Behind him, the last candles flickered on the altar, their wax pooling like tears. The air smelled of incense and smoke. Heaven and earth mingled together. He whispered a final prayer, not for the living, not even for the dead, but for peace between them. Outside, the villagers slept at last. The bowls on their doorsteps gleamed faintly in the starlight. By morning, the bread would be gone, the milk sour, and no one would speak of how or why. The church would continue its vigils. The bells would ring again next year, and the people would still light their fires. For all its authority, the church had not erased Samhain, it had baptized it. The prayers had new names, the rituals new meanings, but beneath it all, the same truth endured, that humanity could never quite stop reaching out to the dead. That every candle lit, every bell rung, every crumb of bread left to the night was an echo of that oldest belief. That love does not end with death, it only changes its shape. As the bells of All Souls' Eve faded into the damp air, the world slipped once more into twilight. The great fires of the hilltops had burned low, leaving behind soft red coals glowing like tired hearts. The villagers retreated to their cottages, shutters drawn tight, candles burning low in their windows. But in the narrow lanes between the houses, life began to stir again, the faint shuffle of feet, the murmur of children's voices, and the soft clink of coins in small, rough hands. This was souling the medieval echo of what the modern world would one day call trick-or-treating. But there were no costumes here, no masks, no sugar-glazed smiles, just the living and the dead, bound together by hunger, faith, and hope. Souling began with the poor, the peasants who had nothing to offer the world but their prayers. On All Hallows' Eve and All Souls' Day, they walked from door to door in the chill, carrying little lanterns made from hollowed turnips or clay pots filled with coals from the sacred fires. Their faces were half-lit, half-shadowed, like souls caught between two realms. When the door opened, they would bow their heads and begin to sing, "A soul, a soul, a soul cake, please, good mistress. A soul cake, 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, and 3 for him who made us all." And the rhythm of the song was simple, its meaning profound. Each soul cake given was a promise that the beggar would pray for the families departed, helping their loved ones ascend from purgatory to paradise. It was both charity and transaction, both faith and necessity. For the rich, it was an act of piety. For the poor, it was survival. The cakes themselves were small, round buns, golden with saffron or spiced with nutmeg, sometimes dotted with raisins. Each bore a cross pressed into its surface before baking, marking it as holy. To eat one was to taste grace. To give one was to share mercy. The church approved. After all, what better way to remind the people that salvation could be fed as well as prayed for? But beyond the stone churches and cathedral towns, in the muddy lanes of England, Ireland, and Wales, souling was more than just doctrine. It was a ritual of the senses. The smell of fresh bread mingled with wood smoke and fog. The flicker of candlelight turned faces into ghosts and halos. The night was filled with soft knocking and murmured blessings. Households waited for the knock. When it came, they would open the door cautiously. for not every visitor on that night was living. The solars, children, widows, beggars stood with open hands. Some carried wooden crosses, others rosaries strung with twine. "Prayers for your kin," they said, and the housewife would nod solemnly, disappearing inside to fetch her offering. Sometimes she gave cakes, warm and fragrant, sometimes apples, nuts, or small coins. The solars would thank her and recite their short blessing. "God have your soul, all the souls that to heaven go, and all the souls in pain below." Then they moved on to the next door, the next family, the next list of names. The night stretched endlessly ahead of them, a patchwork of firelight and shadow. To the children, it was adventure. To the poor, it was life. In a world where famine was never far and bread was often measured by grace, a night of knocking meant survival for another week. But it was more than hunger that drove them. There was reverence in the ritual, a belief that their prayers mattered, that the words they spoke could reach beyond the grave. It was said that for every soul cake eaten, one soul was freed from purgatory. And so, when the night's collection was done, the solars gathered in barns or tavern corners, counting their treasures. They divided the cakes, whispered the names of the dead, and ate in silence, each bite a prayer, each crumb a promise fulfilled. Some sang as they ate, their voices rising through the rafters. One for the mother, two for the son, three for the spirit, the Holy One. For every cake, a soul shall rise and find its way to paradise. It was a strange kind of communion, not of chalice and altar, but of hunger and hope. In towns and cities, the custom grew more elaborate. Guilds organized processions, with singers in long cloaks and hoods carrying banners and lanterns. They walked through the streets in solemn columns, their songs echoing off the cold stone walls. Rich households prepared trays of cakes and mulled wine to distribute, while servants stood at the doors handing out alms. The poor received food, the rich received prayers, and the church received peace for one more year, at least. But not everyone saw the practice as holy. Some priests frowned upon the mixing of superstition and sanctity. "No food can free a soul," they warned from their pulpits. "Only repentance and the mercy of God." Yet the people continued. Faith, to them, was not confined to the church. It was baked in bread, sung in streets, passed from hand to hand in the cold night air. There were darker sides to the tradition too. Some solars grew bold, demanding offerings rather than asking. "Give us our cake, or your house shall see misfortune." They would say, half jest, half threat. Mischief accompanied the prayers. Gates were lifted from hinges, animals turned loose, carts overturned. The line between blessing and curse blurred as easily as the boundary between the living and the dead. In time, landlords and noble households began to see souling not just as piety, but as performance. They invited minstrels and jesters to soul within their halls, to sing songs for the souls of ancestors in exchange for food, coin, or wine. Thus, the custom crept upward through society, transforming from necessity to ceremony. In every class, the dead were remembered, but the means of remembrance varied by wealth. In the poorest cottages, a single candle and a loaf were enough. In the manor houses, tables groaned with platters of cakes and roasted meats for the souls of noble kin. The priests were called to bless these feasts, though they knew full well that few guests, living or dead, would ever taste them. Still, the meaning endured. For one night, the gulf between poverty and privilege seemed to narrow. The poor prayed for the souls of the rich fed the bodies of the poor. Both sides, in their own way, sought redemption. By the firelight of those autumn nights, children learned the oldest lesson of all, that giving and receiving were not opposites but reflections. The bread that passed from hand to hand was not just food, it was connection, the soft echo of community in a world divided by class and fear. In the north of England, records tell of whole villages joining in the ritual. From house to house, people moved in quiet procession, each carrying a lantern carved from a turnip or beet, a small glowing skull to light the way for lost souls. They believed the lanterns guided the dead to the prayers being offered for them, keeping them from wandering astray. And though the air was cold and the ground slick with mist, there was warmth in the ritual. Doors opened not just to give bread, but to exchange words, news, kindness, The night became less of mourning, more of remembrance. It was, perhaps, the first glimpse of what modern people would call the spirit of Halloween, that mingling of fear and festivity, reverence and joy. For all its simplicity, Soling carried a profound beauty. It was a reminder that even in a harsh, unforgiving world, people found ways to make compassion tangible. In the act of knocking on a stranger's door, they acknowledged a truth the church itself could not deny, that every soul, rich or poor, living or dead, hungered for connection. By the 13th century, the custom had spread across much of Britain. In Ireland, they called it going a souling. In Wales, Synod Merv, the messenger of the dead. Each region added its own touches, its own songs. In some places, soulers wore masks to represent the spirits they prayed for. In others, they carried symbols of death, black ribbons, wooden crosses, sprigs of rosemary. And when the long night was over, when the last candle had guttered out and the fog began to lift, the villages seemed changed. The streets were littered with crumbs. The smell of spice lingered in the air, and the first birds of morning sang softly from the hedges. The people believed their prayers had been heard, their dead comforted. The children, their bellies full of cakes, slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The poor counted their coins and gave thanks. The priests, though wary of the practice's pagan shadow, recorded it nonetheless, proof, perhaps, that faith had found its own language. Over time, souling would fade, replaced by other customs, reshaped by the centuries into something less solemn, more playful. But in its essence, the knocking at doors, the exchange of food for blessings, the soft laughter in the dark, it never truly disappeared. And perhaps that is why, even today, when children go from house to house with plastic pumpkins and paper ghosts, the echo of those medieval prayers still lingers. Beneath the masks and the candy, there remains a trace of that ancient night when the living fed the dead, and the poor became the voices of salvation. For in the end, the soul cake was never really about hunger or doctrine. It was about memory, about the human need to believe that kindness, however small, can reach beyond death itself. And so, on those long ago autumn nights, as the last of the fog curled around the cottages and the lanterns flickered low, one could almost hear the faint refrain drifting through the dark. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, 3 for him who made us all. The song faded into silence, but the hope behind it, that the living could feed the lost, and the dead could bless the living, burned quietly on, like the embers of a long-forgotten fire. By the time the last soul cakes had been eaten, and the night grew deep again, the village seemed quieter but not at peace. The fog had returned, creeping along the hedgerows, swallowing the moon. It carried with it the familiar unease of All Hallows' Eve, that cold certainty that the dead were still abroad. The candles in the church had long burned out, and the bells had fallen silent, leaving only the whisper of wind through empty lanes. In such stillness, even faith could tremble. It was in these moments, when the prayers felt too thin and the dark too thick, that another old custom took hold. Long before pumpkins and painted faces, long before laughter replaced dread, there were masks. The people called them faces for the dead. They were crude things, rough, handmade, smelling of earth and smoke. Some were carved from bark or fashioned from scraps of hide. Others were smeared with soot or ash until the wearer's features disappeared into shadow. The purpose was simple, or at least it seemed so. If the dead wandered, it was safer to look like one of them. The practice likely began with fear, as most things in the Middle Ages did. The church had taught the people to pray for the souls in purgatory, but it had not taught them how to live beside ghosts. So the villagers invented their own armor. They wore the faces of the departed so that the wandering spirits would pass them by, mistaking them for kin. It was not vanity, there was no beauty in it. The masks were ugly, unsettling, eye holes cut too wide, mouths stitched into grimaces. Some wore the skulls of animals, deer or oxen, polished white in the firelight. Others wrapped themselves in ragged cloaks or sheepskins, transforming into monstrous silhouettes that staggered through the mist. To a stranger's eye, it would have looked like madness, a village of phantoms haunting itself. But to those who lived it, it was survival. Imagine a farmer, his fields gone fallow after harvest, his heart heavy with the names of his dead. He pulls a scrap of hide from the barn, cuts holes for eyes, and ties it around his face with twine. The leather smells of blood and smoke. His breath condenses behind it, warm and ghostly. For one night, he becomes someone else, or perhaps something else. He walks the lanes without fear, because if the dead look his way, they'll see only another shadow. The idea spread, quietly and quickly. Children were the first to take to it with excitement rather than dread. They giggled as they smeared soot on their cheeks, daring one another to knock on doors in disguise. Their laughter echoed through the lanes like sparks, small, bright rebellions against the night. The elders frowned, but secretly, they were relieved. Laughter was a kind of charm, too. Before long, the practice became part of the ritual. When the fog rolled in and the prayers were done, the villagers donned their disguises. They gathered by the fires, faces hidden, voices altered. No one knew who stood beside whom, neighbor, stranger, or spirit. The anonymity was intoxicating. Fear gave way to mischief. For a few hours, the world turned upside down. The living imitated the dead. The poor mocked the rich. The meek mimicked their masters. It was said that even the spirits were confused. When all wear the face of death, the old saying went, death forgets whom to take. The church, of course, disapproved. Priests saw in these masks the remnant of older, darker worship, a pagan echo that refused to die. They called it folly, sin, even witchcraft. No man may mock God's creation by wearing the visage of a beast, thundered one preacher in York, for he who hides his face may lose his soul. Yet, like all condemnations, the words failed to reach the countryside. Out in the thatched villages, far from cathedral bells, the people did what they always had. They blended faith with fear until the two were indistinguishable. For them, the mask was not rebellion. It was prayer in another form. If a candle was light for the spirit, then a mask was protection for the body. And if it made the children laugh while the wind howled through the graves, then perhaps even God would forgive a little foolishness. Some masks became elaborate with time. The wealthier villagers began to decorate them, stitching bits of colored cloth, fastening feathers or dried flowers. A few carved wooden faces with exaggerated features, long noses, hollow eyes, grinning mouths. These death masks were said to scare away the spirits who grew too curious. Ironically, they also amused the living. People began to dance in them around the dying bonfires, spinning until sparks leapt into the sky. Thus the line blurred, as it always does, between fear and festivity. What began as protection soon turned to parody. The people who once trembled before the dead now mocked them not out of disrespect, but as a way of claiming power over what they feared most. Laughter became an exorcism. In many regions, this night of disguises became known as mumming night, from the old word mum, meaning to mask or to be silent. Groups of villagers, their faces hidden, went from house to house, performing small plays or songs in exchange for food and ale. The stories were simple battles between good and evil, the triumph of St. George over the dragon, but the meaning was deeper. It was a dramatization of the human struggle against the unknown, the eternal fight to keep the dark at bay. Some mummers played the part of death himself, draped in white cloth and carrying a wooden scythe. Others were devils, wild men, or ghosts. The audience laughed and cheered, but they also crossed themselves, because even as they mocked death, they knew it was never far. And yet, there was something healing in that laughter. To look upon a skull and grin back at it, to wear its face and dance, was to declare, if only for a moment, that fear could be outwitted. It was not blasphemy. It was survival through performance. In the glow of torchlight, the masked figures looked almost holy in their absurdity, like saints of the soil, bearing witness to the fragile boundary between worlds. The firelight flickered across their disguises, turning hides into halos, soot into sacred shadow. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, torn between awe and delight. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and cider, a feast for the senses, a rebellion against the coming winter. By midnight, the masks had done their work. The living had faced the night and survived it. They would remove the hides, wipe the soot from their faces, and laugh softly at one another's smudged features. The fear that had crept in with the fog was gone, not banished, but transformed. Some said the spirits themselves joined the revels, slipping into the crowd unseen, borrowing a mask or two to taste the warmth of life once more. When the dead dance with the living, the old women whispered, "The world remembers it is one body." Over time, this custom of disguise became so familiar that few remembered why it had begun. Children wore masks for fun, adults for tradition. The old terror faded, replaced by merriment. But deep beneath the laughter, something older endured the instinct to hide from what cannot be understood, to confuse the darkness by wearing its face. The church eventually made its peace with it, as it had with so many pagan relics. The masks were tolerated, if not blessed. Priests would remind their flocks that these were but harmless customs, so long as the heart remains devout. Yet in private, even the most pious might feel a shiver when they saw a soot-blackened face pass by the window at dusk. For centuries, the practice persisted, evolving with each generation. In time, the hides and ashes gave way to finer materials: cloth, paint, carved wood. The mummers' masks became more theatrical, the plays more comic. And though the people no longer spoke of wandering spirits, some part of them still believed the disguises had power. Even in laughter, they remembered fear. And so, from those rough beginnings, from soot and leather, from trembling hands and whispered prayers, the idea of costume was born. Not the bright silks of modern revelry, but something rawer, more sacred. A second skin for the soul, woven from dread and defiance. When the villagers finally slept, their masks hung from pegs beside the hearths. In the dim light, they looked almost alive, watching, waiting. The fire's last embers glowed beneath them like eyes half-lidded with fatigue. Perhaps, in some small way, the masks had taken on the burden of fear, so their makers could rest. Outside, the fog thinned. The fields lay still beneath the waning moon. The dead, if they had walked that night, walked unseen, and the living, soot-streaked and weary, dreamed peacefully in their beds. They had faced the darkness, not by conquering it, but by becoming part of it just enough to survive until morning. Thus, out of fear came art. Out of superstition came tradition. And from the trembling hearts of medieval peasants came the first costumes, fragile disguises worn not for spectacle, but for safety. They were never meant to delight. They were meant to protect. And perhaps, somewhere beneath the centuries of laughter that followed, they still do. When the masks came off and the bonfires burned to coals, the night was still not over. The villagers, soot-streaked and weary from laughter and fear alike, knew that the danger lingered long after the flames dimmed. The dead, it was said, were slow to leave. Spirits followed warmth like moths to flame, drawn to the living breath, the sound of footsteps, the faint glow of a candle through shuttered windows. And so, even after the prayers were whispered and the disguises hung by the hearth, one final layer of protection was needed. A shield not of wood or hide, but of faith and superstition woven together. For that, the people turned to charm small, humble things of desperate faith. In the hush between midnight and dawn, when even the dogs stopped barking, the villagers reached for the trinkets they trusted most. Little bells, crosses of wood or iron, sprigs of rowan and ash, bits of bone, carved symbols tucked into pockets or sewn into cloaks. They were tokens of comfort, of memory, of fear, the last defense against the invisible. Each one told a story, whispered from one generation to the next, of spirits driven away by sound, of curses turned aside by iron, of prayers stitched into the seams of everyday life. The church said that faith alone was enough, but the church did not live in the dark. And so, the people carried both faith in their hearts, superstition in their hands. The small bells were the most common, and the most beloved. They hung from doorways and around the necks of animals, their soft chiming a constant reassurance. A bell sound, they believed, could not be tolerated by unholy things. The tone itself was pure, uncorrupted. It cut through the fog like sunlight. When the wind passed through the village at night and set the bells trembling, people said it was the angels walking, their wings brushing against the mortal world. Mothers tied bells to the cradles of infants, to keep away fairies or wandering souls that might covet a newborn's warmth. Farmers hung them from cattle horns before driving them to pasture, muttering, "Ring clear, ring true, till the devil passes you." Even the smallest cottage kept one by the door, to be rung in times of storm or sickness, not just as warning, but as ward. Crosses were next, and they came in many forms, not just the fine gold crucifixes of the church, but rough wooden ones carved by hand, bound with twine, or burned into doors with the tip of a hot poker. Some wore them openly, others hid them inside clothing, close to the heart. A few even marked them in ash upon their foreheads before bed, as both prayer and barrier. But these crosses were not always entirely Christian. Many were etched with strange looping designs, runes from older days, symbols that predated Christ but somehow survived beneath his shadow. To the villagers, there was no contradiction in this. Faith was not a matter of purity. It was a matter of survival. If a charm worked, it was blessed, no matter whose god had made it. The priests knew of this mingling and tolerated it, reluctantly. After all, what could they say to a widow who hung a cross of rowan over her door because her husband had died after the last one fell? Or to a farmer who traced both a cross and an old Celtic spiral into his barn wall because he couldn't afford another bad harvest? For all their talk of doctrine, even the priests carried talismans and secret tiny relics of saints wrapped in cloth, silver crucifixes kissed before sleep, the occasional bell blessed under the guise of church necessity. Faith and fear are old companions. Sometimes, the people added words to their defenses, whispered charms, half prayers, half spells. These were never written down. They lived in the breath of the speaker. A grandmother murmuring over a candle flame, a shepherd whispering to the wind. "God save me from the wandering soul, the witch and the wolf," they said, tracing the sign of the cross on their chests. That single phrase carried centuries of terror. The wandering soul, the restless dead who might mistake the living for company. The witch, not always an old crone, but anyone whose glance lingered too long, whose words carried a shadow. The wolf, both beast and metaphor, the symbol of hunger, of winter, of things that devour. To be saved from these was to be saved from the worst the world could offer. Sometimes the charm was spoken while turning a small ring or holding a charm in the palm. Sometimes it was murmured into the fire, letting the smoke carry it heavenward. And sometimes it was said silently, lips unmoving, when a door creaked open or a shadow passed too close. In this dance between superstition and sanctity, the medieval world found its rhythm. Bells and crosses, chants and charms, they were all part of a single language, half spoken to God and half to the unknown. To live was to balance between them. There were rituals for everything. Before lighting the evening fire, some villagers would toss a pinch of salt into the flame, murmuring, "As this burns clean, so may my soul." Before stepping out into the fog, they would touch the nearest piece of iron, a door latch, a horseshoe, believing it would guard them from evil. Even holy water, meant for baptism and blessing, was used in ways the church never intended. A few drops on the threshold to keep the dead from crossing. A sprinkle over the livestock before winter to ensure they'd survive. Some kept bottles of it hidden behind icons to anoint the sick or ward off curses. And yet, for all its pagan remnants, there was beauty in this mingling. The people did not see contradiction, they saw continuity. To them, the world was full of forces both kind and cruel, and one needed every protection possible. The church's prayers were powerful, yes, but so was the rowan tree, the sound of iron, the whisper of an ancient charm carried by generations. In the quiet after midnight, the sound of a single bell might carry through the mist, soft, trembling, uncertain. Perhaps a mother rocking a child, perhaps a shepherd keeping vigil. The sound drifted across the fields like a heartbeat, reminding all who heard it that life still moved within the sleeping earth. There was one story, told from the Welsh hills to the Scottish moors, about a monk who scoffed at such charms. He preached against them, saying, "Only prayer shields the soul, not trinkets of man." But one night, while traveling alone between abbeys, a fog rose thicker than any he had known. He heard footsteps behind him, slow and dragging. When he turned, he saw no one, only a shadow that moved when he did not. He reached for his crucifix, but his trembling hand dropped it. The sound of bells from a distant village reached him then, faint, clear, and steady. The shadow paused, then receded into the mist. The monk returned home the next morning and said nothing to his brothers. But from that night on, he kept a small silver bell tied to his belt. In that story, as in all such tales, lies the heart of the age, the belief that the world was porous, that heaven and earth, life and death, faith and fear all mingled together like smoke in a churchyard breeze. The villagers believed the same. They hung bells by their doors, not only for protection, but as a kind of greeting, a promise to whatever passed in the night that they meant no harm. The charms and crosses were not weapons, but invitations to peace. We honor you, they seemed to say, but we are still living. Leave us be. The church, for its part, found ways to sanctify the practice. Bells were blessed and called sanctus bells. Their ringing during Mass was said to drive away demons. Crosses carved into bread or drawn in flour before baking were declared symbols of devotion. Even herbs like rosemary and thyme, once used for spells, were rebranded as holy plants. And so, superstition became liturgy by another name. The mingling of pagan and Christian faiths was not an accident. It was survival made sacred. The people of the Middle Ages did not see themselves as heretics, but as pragmatists. They lived in a world where plague, famine, and death came without warning. In such a world, every sound, symbol, and gesture mattered. A bell might not stop death, but it could make the darkness seem smaller. By the faint glow of the hearth, children learned these customs like bedtime prayers. A mother might press a tiny cross into her child's palm and whisper, "If you hear footsteps in the fog, ring your bell once, not twice, and they will pass you by." The child would nod solemnly, clutching the charm as though it held the strength of angels. And perhaps, in a way, it did. For belief itself, that fierce, trembling trust in something unseen, was the truest protection of all. Whether it was the power of Christ or the echo of older gods, the people did not care. What mattered was that it gave them courage to walk through the long, haunted night between autumn and winter. By dawn, the bells had fallen silent again. Dew clung to the grass, glistening like the remnants of some vanished magic. The charms hung from doorways, damp but unbroken. The crosses above the hearths caught the first light of morning, their shadows stretching across the walls. The night had passed. The dead had been remembered, the living had been spared, and the fragile truce between fear and faith had held another year. In the end, that was the true essence of medieval Halloween, not the fire, not the masks, not even the prayers, but the quiet hope that something small, a bell, a cross, a whispered charm might keep the darkness at bay just long enough for dawn to return. And as the first rooster crowed over the waking village, a final bell chimed softly in the breeze, a farewell to the ghosts, a benediction to the living, and a promise that when the next dark season came, humanity would once again find its courage in sound, symbol, and silence. When the bells fell silent and the last prayers for the dead drifted into the smoke-choked rafters, the villagers returned to their cottages. The air outside was sharp with frost, and the mist coiled low across the fields like a living thing. Inside, the hearth became the center of the world, the only light, the only warmth, the only comfort against the long medieval night. The wind moaned in the chimney, the fire spat and hissed. Shadows danced across rough plaster walls like spirits come to listen. It was then, in that fragile space between fear and fellowship, that the oldest of all traditions began, the telling of ghost stories. The stories did not belong to any one faith or class. They were shared by monks and masons, by peasants and knights alike. In a world where death was constant, where a bad harvest, a fever, or a raid could snuff out a life without warning, the dead were never far from thought. Yet these tales were not the shrieking horrors of later centuries. They were moral tales, cautionary parables disguised as hauntings. The purpose was not to terrify, but to remind, not to amuse, but to instruct. A father would stir the embers with a stick and begin softly, his voice low enough that the children had to lean close. They say, he would murmur, that once, in the abbey down the river, there was a monk who took the silver meant for the poor. The story unfolded in firelight. The monk's greed, his sudden illness, the night he was buried beneath the church floor. Then came the haunting, the creak of footsteps on stone, the rattle of chains, the face glimpsed behind the altar flame. The lesson was clear. sin lingers, even after breath departs. The church, though wary of superstition, rarely condemned such tales. They served its purpose well enough. Ghost stories made abstract theology visible. They turned purgatory into something a child could picture, the wandering soul, heavy with guilt, pacing through the fog until prayers or penance released it. Fear of damnation was easier to teach when it wore a human face. There were endless variations of these fireside parables. Some spoke of knights who broke their vows, returning as hollow-eyed riders whose horses made no sound. Others told of brides who died before their wedding day and walked forever in their wedding gowns, clutching wilted flowers. One tale from the northern shires told of a midwife who failed to baptize a dying infant in time. Every All Hallows Eve, the baby's cry was heard in the wind, begging for a name. The stories traveled with the seasons. In summer, they were told softly and laughed at. In winter, they felt like warnings. Each family added its own flourishes. The monk became a local friar. The knight bore a familiar crest. The bride wore the neighbor's red hair. Fact and fiction blurred until history itself seemed haunted. Children listened with wide eyes, clutching the hems of their mother's skirts. They were not supposed to scream. That would insult the dead. Instead, they were taught to cross themselves at the end of each tale and whisper a prayer. God rest all souls still wandering. It was both protection and acknowledgement, an unspoken truce between the living and those who refused to stay buried. Sometimes the storyteller was not the father but the grandmother, the oldest voice in the room, her face lined like the bark of an old oak. Her tone was slower, more deliberate, as though she had seen these spirits herself. I remember, she would say, staring into the flames, the winter the snow came early, and they found Brother Edmund walking the cloister, barefoot and white as ash. Everyone would fall silent, the fire crackling like bones, until she smiled faintly and added, "So mind you, say your prayers before sleep." The moral was never hidden. Each ghost stood for something the living feared: greed, pride, betrayal, forgotten duty. The afterlife in these tales was not a far-off realm, but a mirror held up to daily life. The road from sin to specter was short. In some cottages, the stories took on local color. Near the sea, fishermen spoke of drowned sailors whose souls glowed like lanterns beneath the waves, guiding the living away from storms. In mountain villages, shepherds told of spectral dogs, guardians, or omens, depending on who saw them first. And in towns shadowed by castles, the hauntings often involved nobles. For the higher one's station, the farther one had to fall. There was one tale told from Cornwall to Kent about Sir Alaric of Thornbridge, a knight so proud that he forbade the village bells from ringing, claiming they disturbed his sleep. He died suddenly on a hunt, thrown from his horse into a thorn bush. On the next All Hallows Eve, the villagers heard bells tolling, though the church tower stood empty. They said Sir Alaric's ghost was ringing them himself, begging forgiveness. The story spread for centuries, retold by candlelight as both justice and warning. Pride silences the soul. Even monks, in their cloisters, kept their own versions. Chroniclers recorded apparitions not as entertainment but as evidence. A 12th century Cistercian manuscript from Yorkshire tells of a young novice who was tempted to flee the abbey and take a lover. On the night he planned his escape, a vision appeared, another monk, gray and hollow-eyed, holding a skull. The apparition spoke only once. "Flesh is ash. Desire is dust." The novice took his vows the next morning. The chronicler concluded, "Thus God chastened him with mercy." In these stories, the supernatural was not random chaos, but moral order made visible. The dead walked not because the world was cursed, but because justice was unfinished. Each haunting was a confession, each ghost a sermon wrapped in mist. Yet despite their solemn lessons, the nights were not without comfort. Storytelling itself was an act of defiance, a way of holding darkness at bay with words and warmth. As the fire burned low, the listeners drew closer, shoulders touching, the circle of light shrinking but never breaking. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Inside, humanity endured through shared imagination. Sometimes, after the stories ended, someone would add a quiet coda, a personal encounter, a half-remembered dream. "My grandfather saw the gray lady once," a boy might whisper. She stood by the well and vanished when he crossed himself. The adults would nod, neither confirming nor denying. To believe completely was foolish. To disbelieve entirely was dangerous. There was power in that ambiguity. The ghost story was a bridge between the sacred and the profane, the rational and the mystical. It allowed the church to speak of penance without pulpit, and the people to confront mortality without despair. In the glow of the hearth, fear became instruction. Death became dialogue. As the years passed, these tales grew roots in every household. They were retold in taverns, in monasteries, in the halls of lords. Even the educated joined in. Scholars of Oxford and Paris collected accounts of hauntings as moral case studies. Thomas of Cantimpré, a Dominican writer, once declared that ghostly visitations were letters from purgatory, God's own way of reminding mankind that no sin went unpaid. The Reformation centuries later would frown upon such tales, dismissing them as superstition. But by then, they had already seeped too deep into the European soul. Ghosts had become part of the moral language of the Middle Ages, not demons to exorcise, but mirrors to study. Back in the cottages, the final embers glowed red as hearts. The children dozed against their mother's arms, the last storyteller's words still hanging in the air. Someone would stir the ashes, covering them gently so that a few coals remained for morning. Let them rest, they'd say, meaning both the fire and the spirits. The room would darken, and the hush that followed felt almost sacred. Outside, the wind carried fragments of old songs, laments for the dead, blessings for the living. The night was vast, but it no longer seemed empty. Every creak, every sigh of wind, every flicker of dying flame held a story, a presence. That was the quiet genius of medieval ghost tales. They made death familiar. They taught that the dead were not to be mocked or feared, but remembered. A spirit who walked the earth was not a monster, but a moral reminder. To live rightly, to die well, to keep faith, these were the true lessons whispered between the cracks of every haunting. And so, on each All Hallows' Eve, long before the pumpkins and costumes, the people of the Middle Ages gathered not for thrills, but for wisdom wrapped in wonder. They told of monks who sinned, knights who broke vows, brides who never wed not to scare their children, but to remind them that every choice echoes beyond the grave. As the last spark of the hearth dimmed and the world sank once more into darkness, one could almost imagine the ghosts themselves listening at the door, nodding in approval. The living had not forgotten them. Their stories, told by trembling voices beside the fire, kept the boundary between life and death tender, human, and alive. For in that age of smoke and faith, storytelling was not entertainment, it was remembrance, redemption, and the oldest prayer of all. May the dead teach the living before dawn comes again. As the last of the ghost stories faded into the crackling of the hearth, another ritual began, quieter, but no less sacred. For in the medieval mind, remembrance of the dead was always paired with gratitude for the living. The telling of tales gave way to the breaking of bread. It was time to eat not in celebration, but in survival. Halloween, or All Hallows' Eve, marked the turning of the year's wheel, the end of harvest, the beginning of the cold. It was both a feast and a farewell, the final table laid before the long, merciless winter. Outside, frost clung to the thatched eaves and turned the last fallen leaves to silver. Inside, the air smelled of smoke, ale, and roasted grain. The villagers gathered in their cottages, or, in wealthier manors, in timbered halls where torches hissed against damp stone. Every plate, every jug, every loaf on the table carried more meaning than mere nourishment. Each was a charm against hunger, a reminder that life, for now, had been spared. Apples were at the center of it all, the last sweetness of the year, picked before the frost could spoil them. They gleamed in baskets beside the fire, red and gold like captured embers. Children bit into them with sticky smiles, while elders murmured prayers of thanks to both God and the soil. For centuries before Christianity reached these shores, apples had been sacred symbols of knowledge, of temptation, of the thin line between life and death. Even in the church's new calendar, that symbolism endured. To bite into one was to taste both blessing and warning. Then came the nuts, hazelnuts, chestnuts, and walnuts, roasted on iron pans over open flames. They popped and cracked like small fireworks, filling the room with their sharp, earthy scent. The people believed that nuts could speak. If two burn side by side, they said, their owners shall be wed before the year is done. So, after the main meal, the youths would take turns naming pairs of nuts, one for themselves, one for the person they fancied, and drop them into the fire. If the nuts burned together, love would prosper. If one jumped away, heartbreak would follow. Laughter and teasing filled the air, but beneath the play there was belief. In a world ruled by chance and weather, even the smallest omen mattered. This was the heart of medieval Halloween. Every act of joy balanced on the edge of fear. The tables themselves were humble, yet generous by the standards of the time. Thick loaves of rye bread, still warm from the oven. Bowls of pottage, a slow-cooked stew of barley, beans, and whatever root vegetables remained from harvest. On special nights like this, there might even be a bit of meat, a rabbit, a salted fish, or the last hen that no longer laid eggs. Butter was spread thickly, for by midwinter it would be scarce. Cider and ale flowed freely. It was safer than water and kinder to the spirit. In the corners, the poorer families made do with what they had. A crust of bread, a piece of turnip roasted black, a cup of thin broth, but even they took part in the ritual of the feast. For this was not only a meal of abundance, but of remembrance. A plate was often left empty, a candle placed beside it, a seat for the soul of a loved one. Bread or fruit would be set there through the night, an offering to the wandering dead who might pass by. Better to feed a ghost, people said, than to have one hungry at your door. It was not greed that motivated these offerings, but respect and fear, the most ancient of courtesies. For while the church preached of heaven and salvation, the villagers knew too well the ways of hunger and loss. They had buried too many children, too many friends taken by sickness or snow. If the dead came back on this night, they were to be treated as guests, not monsters. So the feast became both supper and prayer. Every bite carried the echo of a benediction. For the hands that planted, they said, for the soil that gave, for the dead who taught us to survive. It was a kind of thanksgiving centuries before the word existed, a ritual older than Christ, older than kings. In noble houses, the customs took on grander form. Banquets were held in great halls hung with evergreen garlands. Minstrels played soft music while servants brought out trenchers of spiced fruit, honeyed cakes, and roasted meats glazed with ale. The nobles feasted not only to mark the season, but to assert power over it, to prove that wealth could hold winter at bay. Yet even they did not dine without superstition. A silver cup of cider was poured out by the door for the dead. A sprig of rosemary burned at the table's edge to keep the chill of spirits from the room. At some tables, apple games began. The most famous bobbing for apples was said to have started here, centuries before it became a children's pastime. In a wooden basin filled with water, apples floated like little moons. Young men and women would kneel to catch them with their teeth, not merely for fun, but for prophecy. To seize an apple on the first try meant marriage within the year. To fail 3 times was bad luck. The laughter that followed was half amusement, half nervousness, because who could say where luck ended and fate began? Other forms of divination filled the night. Some would peel an apple in one long strip and toss the skin over their shoulder. The letter it formed on the floor was said to reveal the initial of a future spouse. Others melted lead into water, watching the shapes that formed as signs from the beyond. Firelight flickered on every hopeful face, turning ordinary games into acts of ritual. The church tolerated most of these customs, so long as they were framed as innocent fun. But in remote villages, priests still frowned when they heard of girls walking backward into moonlit orchards, hoping to glimpse their future husbands' shadows between the trees. Folly, the clergy called it. Yet the people persisted because the desire to know the future was older and stronger than doctrine. And in truth, these small acts of magic gave comfort. Winter was coming, and with it uncertainty. Would the harvest stores last? Would the animals survive the frost? Would loved ones return from war or sickness? The games, the food, the laughter, they were charms against despair. If an apple peel could predict happiness, if a roasted nut could promise love, then perhaps the world was not so cruel after all. Meanwhile, outside the windows, the cold deepened. The bonfires on the hills had burned low, their glow barely visible through the mist. Yet the scent of roasting apples and nuts drifted into the night, mingling with the smoke and offering to any spirits still wandering, a reminder that the living were grateful for another season's breath. In some regions, the feast carried an even older tradition, the dumb supper. It was held in silence, often by unmarried women. Each would set a place for her unseen guest, sometimes a future husband, sometimes a spirit from beyond. They would eat slowly, without speaking, their faces lit only by candlelight. When the last bite was taken, they'd listen for a sigh, a rustle, a faint knock. It was said that if the spirits were kind, they'd send a sign of what was to come. These were the shadows of an older world, woven seamlessly into the medieval one. Christianity had baptized the feast with new meaning prayers for souls instead of offerings to gods. But the bones of the tradition remained the same. The harvest had ended. Life hung by a thread. To eat, to drink, to tell fortunes, to laugh. These were acts of defiance against the cold, affirmations that life still had flavor, even with death watching from the window. In many ways, the feast was a mirror of the people themselves, humble, uncertain, yet filled with fierce endurance. Every loaf of bread told a story of labor, every apple a story of hope. To share food on All Hallows' Eve was to share courage. By the end of the night, the tables were cleared, the crumbs swept into the fire, and the candles left burning low. The people would step outside once more to breathe the cold air. They might toss the apple cores into the field, saying softly, "For the souls that wander, for the soil that sleeps." Then they'd close their doors tight, bar them against the dark, and let the last warmth of the feast sink into their bones. In the stillness that followed, only the crackle of the hearth remained, and perhaps the faint scent of apples, lingering like memory. The villagers would drift to sleep with full bellies and quieter hearts, dreaming of spring even as winter's shadow crept closer. That was medieval Halloween, not the revel of masks and mischief we know today, but a night of sacred balance. Food and fear, faith and fire, the living and the dead, all sat together at the same table. Every bite was a prayer, every laugh a charm. And when morning came and frost glazed the fields, the people would rise to face another year, poorer perhaps, but braver for having eaten, spoken, and remembered. The feast had done its work. It had reminded them that even in a world haunted by death, life in all its fragile sweetness was still worth tasting. The fire from the feast burned low, leaving only a bed of red embers glowing beneath the ashes. Outside, the night stretched cold and endless, a vast silence broken only by the sound of wind against wood. It was the hour when even the dogs ceased to bark, when the living huddled close to their fires and dared not look toward the fields. For in the minds of medieval folk, this was the time when the veil between worlds thinned, and not all who walked beneath the moon were holy. They called them wise women in the daylight, healers, midwives, keepers of secrets whispered from mother to daughter. But on a night like this, when the old pagan fire still burned beneath Christian hymns, those same women were spoken of in lowered voices and guarded glances. To some, they were the village's protectors. To others, they were its greatest peril. And as All Hallows' Eve deepened into darkness, no one could say for certain which they would be. The fear of witches, or what would later become the great witch hunts, had its roots in this uneasy age. The church had long preached that all sorcery was heresy. Yet in villages far from the eyes of priests, old customs persisted. The healer who could mix herbs to ease a fever was valued, but also watched. Her potions, her muttered charms, her uncanny knowledge of birth and death blurred too easily into something unholy. In an age where sickness struck without warning and crops failed without reason, such knowledge was both hope and temptation. On Halloween night, when spirits were believed to roam, that power took on a sharper edge. People said witches could command the wandering dead, send them to torment enemies, or keep them as servants. A horse found sweating in the stable at dawn, a child who woke screaming, a cow gone dry overnight, all could be the work of a witch seen walking too late beneath the moon. Yet the same people who whispered such accusations would visit her door before midnight. A mother, desperate for her sick infant, might bring a loaf of bread or a handful of coins, begging for a potion. A farmer whose cattle had fallen ill might ask for a charm to hang above the barn. A girl hoping to glimpse her future husband might plead for a mirror spell, and the woman gray-haired, sharp-eyed, smelling of smoke and sage, would give them what they asked for. She would hand them a small pouch of dried leaves, a sprig of rowan tied with thread, or a cup of bitter tea. She might whisper instructions. Burn this before dawn. Don't look behind you. Leave a little milk at your threshold when it's done. They would nod, trembling, and hurry away. By the time the sun rose, gratitude would sour into suspicion. They would cross themselves when passing her house and avoid her gaze at church. Fear was a fickle companion. It needed her at night and despised her by morning. These women lived on the edge of things, on the outskirts of villages, where smoke from their cottages curled into the woods. The forest was their pharmacy and their church. They gathered herbs by moonlight, knowing which root could heal and which could harm. They brewed salves for wounds, tonics for childbirth, teas to quiet the dying. But their craft, passed down from a time before Christendom, spoke the language of both earth and spirit, and that frightened those who no longer understood it. The church called it superstition. The people called it survival. On All Hallows Eve, that tension became unbearable. For the same herbs that warded off plague were also used in charms against spirits. The same prayers said for healing could be twisted into curses. It was said that on this night, witches brewed special potions, mixtures of yew and wolfsbane, mandrake and moonwort, to guard themselves from the dead. Some claimed to have seen them walking barefoot through the fields, scattering herbs into the furrows to feed the ghosts. Others swore they gathered by the old standing stones, chanting in forgotten tongues to keep the winter at bay. Whether these stories were true hardly mattered. The fear was real enough. Every flicker of torchlight in the distance, every shadow that moved against the mist, could be taken as proof. And so, on nights like this, the night watch began. Villagers, carrying torches and cudgels, would walk the outskirts of their settlements, claiming to guard against thieves or spirits, but also to keep an eye on those who might be in league with the dark. They moved in uneasy silence, their breath white in the cold air, their footsteps crunching on frost. A barn door left open, a faint light in the woods, a crow perched too still, all were taken as signs. Sometimes they sang hymns to steady their nerves. Sometimes they whispered prayers half remembered from pagan ancestors. Fire, guard us. Earth, hide us. Keep the dead where they belong. For the women who lived alone, these watches were dangerous. One wrong glance, one word out of place, could bring accusation. A wise woman seen tending her herbs after dark might be called a witch before sunrise. Her skill, once admired, could become her undoing. The same villagers who begged her for charms could drag her before the priest the next day, claiming she had cursed their livestock or spoiled their milk. Yet most of these women did not think of themselves as witches. They saw themselves as caretakers of balance mediators between nature and the divine. Their prayers mixed Latin hymns with ancient invocations. Their cures mingled holy water with crushed nettles and honey. When they spoke of spirits, they meant not demons, but echoes of the dead, those who had not yet found peace. In their minds, they served both God and the people who feared them. Still, fear is an unforgiving judge. One tale told from the northern fens spoke of a healer named Maud, known for her skill with fever and childbirth. Every autumn, she hung dried herbs above her door sage for wisdom, rue for protection. One Halloween night, a neighbor's child fell ill. Maud gave the mother a potion and told her to burn the empty cup in the hearth before dawn. The child recovered, but the next morning, the ashes left behind formed a strange shape, a spiral. The villagers whispered it was the mark of a spell. By the week's end, Maud's house had been burned to the ground. Stories like here traveled quickly, and yet, even as fear consumed them, people could not let go of their need for magic. They feared witches, but they feared a world without them even more. For who else knew how to heal a wound when the priest's Latin failed? Who else could whisper over the cradle when a child refused to wake? The church might preach that prayer was enough, but hunger and illness demanded quicker remedies. The line between saint and sorceress was thin, and necessity blurred it further. So Halloween became the night of contradictions, the night when the village both hunted and sought the same woman. In the wealthier towns, the fear took on darker forms. Priests warned of witches consorting with devils, flying through the night on broomsticks or turning into animals. They said the devil held his own feast on this night, mocking the holy days to come. Artists later painted scenes of women dancing around cauldrons, their faces twisted in glee, but in truth, the witches of the Middle Ages were more likely to be lonely widows than servants of hell. Still, imagination filled the gaps that ignorance left open. The sight of a raven at dusk, the sudden cry of an owl, the flicker of a light in the woods all became proof that evil was abroad. Villagers nailed horseshoes above their doors and scattered salt across thresholds. The bravest might even patrol the graveyard, ensuring no witch disturbed the newly dead. By midnight, the fires burned low and the songs faded. The wise women remained in their cottages, awake listening to the wind. Some prayed, others muttered charms for protection. They knew that once morning came, the fear would fade until the next time the harvest ended and the nights grew long again. The night watchmen returned to their homes, cold and exhausted, convinced they had kept evil at bay. The priests rang the dawn bell, proclaiming the victory of faith. And the witches, or what the world called witches, stepped outside at last, gathering herbs still wet with dew, whispering to the earth as they always had. The world would not remember them kindly. In centuries to come, their kind would be hunted, tortured, and burned in the name of purity. But on this night, in the flickering half-light of medieval Halloween, they were simply what they had always been, the keepers of knowledge too old to die, too useful to abandon, and too dangerous to forgive. Their shadows lingered long after the fires went out. Even the church could not silence their echo. In every village that survived the cold, someone kept a pouch of herbs by the hearth, a charm whispered by a forbidden tongue, a recipe learned from a woman no one dared name aloud. So when the people of the Middle Ages lit their fires on All Hallows' Eve, when they prayed for the dead, ate their apples, and watched the mists crawl across the fields, they knew that the old ways were still watching too. They lived in a world where faith and fear walked hand in hand, and where the line between prayer and spell was as thin as the veil between the living and the dead. And as the dawn finally broke, painting the fields in pale gold, one could imagine a single figure standing at the edge of the woods, a woman with a bundle of herbs in her hand, her cloak smelling of smoke and rosemary. She would look back toward the village, smile faintly, and whisper to herself, "They will curse me today, but tonight they will need me again." Then she would vanish into the trees, her footsteps lost in the mist, leaving behind only the faint scent of sage, the memory of fear, and the knowledge that even in an age of faith, the night still belonged to her. When the last embers of the hearth dimmed and the village fell into uneasy quiet, the people turned their eyes toward the churchyard. It waited at the edge of every settlement, a place neither wholly of the living nor the dead, walled by stone, watched over by crooked yews. On All Hallows' Eve, the path leading there was marked not by daylight but by flame. Candles, hundreds of them, flickered in the darkness, trembling against the wind like stars scattered upon the ground. The church had long declared this night holy, a vigil for the faithful departed, yet the people's hearts carried older instincts. Beneath the Latin hymns and the tolling of bells lay the whisper of something far more ancient, the human need to remember, and the fear of being forgotten. And so, one by one, families emerged from their cottages, cloaked against the chill, carrying candles cupped in trembling hands. The graveyard was not a place of terror then, as it would later become in tales. It was part of life as familiar as the field or the well. Here lay grandparents, mothers, brothers, children who had not survived their first winter. In a world where death sat daily at the table, memory was a kind of prayer. The people came not to summon spirits, but to keep them company, to make sure they were not wandering cold and alone in the dark. At each grave, they lit a candle, a small defiance against the night. The flame, they said, would guide the souls home, showing them the path through purgatory. The church encouraged such acts, though it gave them gentler language. The Vigil of All Souls, a time to pray for those yet unshriven. But for the villagers, it was simpler. The light was love. The flame was memory. The air filled with the mingled scents of wax, tallow, and damp earth. The ground was soft beneath their boots, thick with fallen leaves. Somewhere a bell tolled slow, patient, eternal. Between the tolls came murmurs of prayer, so quiet they seemed part of the wind. Women whispered the names of their dead. Men crossed themselves and gazed toward the sky, as though searching for familiar faces among the stars. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, watching the candlelight dance upon the gravestones, wide-eyed but unafraid. A monk, wrapped in his dark habit, moved among them, his lantern swinging from side to side. He offered blessings in low tones, sprinkling holy water that glimmered briefly in the light. Yet even he paused now and then, as if listening to the sigh of wind through the yew branches, to the faint, almost human rustle among the graves. For in the medieval imagination, the boundary between death and life was not solid but porous, like frost upon glass. Souls were believed to linger until prayers freed them, hovering near their old homes, watching the living with yearning or regret. To light a candle was not only to honor them but to remind them gently, mercifully, that they were remembered still. In the villages near the coast, the ritual took on a spectral beauty. The people would carry their candles to the edge of the sea, placing them in hollowed turnips or scooped-out gourds so the wind could not snuff them. They floated them upon the waves, small islands of gold drifting over black water. From a distance, it looked as though the ocean itself had caught fire, 1,000 tiny souls set free upon the tide. The church frowned on such practices, but the people persisted, murmuring, "The sea carries the lost farther than our prayers." Inland, where the mist lay heavy, the churchyards glowed like beacons. Some said that if one watched long enough, the candles nearest the restless graves would flicker or sway, as if the soul beneath were stirring. Others swore that faint figures could be seen kneeling beside them, not the living, but the dead, come to share their own vigil. No one dared to speak of it too loudly. To name what one saw was to invite it home. But the silence itself was a kind of communion. For a few hours each year, the living and the dead shared the same air, the same light, the same prayer. The people did not fear them, not yet. The witch panics and superstitions of later centuries had not yet poisoned memory. Here, death was not an enemy but a neighbor. The graveyard was an extension of the hearth, and the candles its outer ring of fire. Some stayed until dawn, watching the flames burn low, feeding them with bits of tallow or oil. Others left offerings at the headstones, bread, apples, or cups of cider. A few even left coins, so that the dead might pay their passage through purgatory. "Let no soul walk hungry," they said. "Let no soul wander blind." These gestures, though small, held the weight of centuries' remnants of pagan sacrifice, transformed by Christian mercy. As midnight passed, the mist thickened. The candles seemed to float upon it, each one a fragile world of its own. Faces appeared and vanished within the glow, mothers whispering to children lost in plague years, widowers murmuring to wives buried beneath moss. Sometimes a hand would linger too long upon a stone, the fingers tracing carved letters as though they might stir them back to life. And there were others, those who came, not to mourn but to atone. The guilty, the remorseful, those who carried secrets too heavy to confess. They knelt in the shadows, their faces hidden, muttering prayers for souls they themselves had wronged. The church taught forgiveness, but forgiveness was slow, and guilt was loud. To light a candle was to bargain with the silence, a plea for peace, for the dead and the living alike. In monasteries and abbeys, the vigil was grander but no less solemn. The monks sang the office of the dead through the night, their voices echoing off stone walls like a lament. Hundreds of candles lined the choir stalls, their flames flickering like an ocean of souls. The smell of beeswax mingled with incense and the faint rot of damp stone. Between psalms, the brothers read aloud from the names of benefactors, long-dead kings, lords, peasants alike, reminding themselves that before God, all were equal in decay. Outside those great halls, though, the heart of the vigil remained in the humble village churchyards. The people's faith was instinctive, born not of doctrine but of necessity. They needed to believe their prayers mattered, that light could reach where they could not. For in an age when half of all children never reached adulthood, when war and famine could erase entire families, hope was the only inheritance that endured. There were stories, always stories, of candles that refused to go out no matter the wind, or of flames that burned blue, signaling a soul's release. Some said that if one left the churchyard without glancing back, one's ancestors would bless the coming year. But if one looked behind, one might see them following silent, pale, waiting for acknowledgement. So the people walked home with eyes fixed forward, the glow behind them fading like a memory. By dawn, only a few flames still trembled among the stones. The mist began to lift, revealing frost upon the grass, dew upon the wax. The people returned to their homes, weary and soot-streaked, carrying the strange peace that comes from having faced what one fears most. The church bells rang again, not for morning this time, but for Mass, the beginning of All Saints' Day. The living would kneel, the dead would rest, and for another year the fragile balance between them would hold. Yet something of the night always lingered. In the morning light, the churchyard looked ordinary, the same crooked crosses, the same worn names, but to those who had kept the vigil, it was transformed. Each grave seemed less a prison than a threshold. Each candle stub, cold and white, was proof that love had burned there. Perhaps that was the truest meaning of medieval Halloween. Not horror, not witchcraft, but the courage to remember in the face of loss. The people of those centuries did not hide from death. They met it with prayer and flame, with hands that trembled but did not turn away. They believed that memory itself could be salvation, that by naming the dead aloud, they could keep the world from forgetting its own humanity. As the final smoke drifted from the churchyard, rising like a slow benediction into the pale sky, the village stirred once more. Children fetched water, fires were rekindled, the smell of bread filled the air again. Life resumed, humble and enduring. But that night, the night when candles lit the graves and whispered names carried through the mist, would stay with them until the next autumn, when once again the veil would thin and the living would remember how to speak with the dead. And if, as they slept that morning, a faint scent of wax and earth clung to their dreams, it was not something to fear. It was simply the memory of what they had promised, that as long as their hearts held light, no soul, however lost, would ever walk in darkness alone. By the time the last candles guttered in the churchyard and the mist began to drift across the sleeping village, another sound rose to claim the night, the slow, mournful tolling of bells. It was not loud, nor hurried. Each strike hung in the cold air like a thought too heavy to fade. Across valleys and moors, through forest and fog, the echo carried a voice made of iron and faith, calling out to the souls of the dead. For the medieval mind, the bell was more than metal and motion. It was sacred, almost alive, a voice that could speak to heaven and hell alike. In every town and monastery, bells were blessed with holy water and anointed with oil before ever being rung. They had names, like saints or ships, and were believed to have power over the invisible. When they rang, demons fled, storms softened, and wandering spirits trembled at the sound. On All Hallows' Eve, that belief deepened into ritual. The custom was called tolling for souls. As the churchyards flickered with candlelight, the bells began to speak slow, solemn strokes marking the boundary between the living and the dead. Some churches tolled once for each soul believed to be in purgatory. Others rang until dawn, so that no spirit, however lost, would feel forgotten. The sound was both prayer and warning. Prayer for those who had gone before, and warning for those who still clung to life, reminding them that the same toll would one day be for them. The villagers listened from their homes, wrapped in blankets, the sound threading through their dreams. Each note seemed to carry memory, the face of a parent, a child, a friend, lost to plague or war. Death was no abstraction to them. It was a neighbor, familiar and uninvited. The bell did not bring fear, but acknowledgement. It tolls for them tonight, they said softly, and for us tomorrow. In the monasteries, the practice was more precise, almost liturgical. Monks took turns through the night, pulling the ropes with steady rhythm, their hands blistered from the cold. Each toll was followed by a whispered prayer. Requiem aeternam dona eis. Domine, grant them eternal rest, O Lord. Between the tolls, the silence deepened, vast as the grave itself. The sound of the bell was meant to fill that void, to remind the heavens that the living still cared for the souls below. But there was another, more superstitious layer beneath the faith. Many believed that the ringing itself frightened the dead, that the vibration of holy sound kept restless spirits from crossing too far into the world of the living. The church, sensing the usefulness of such belief, did not discourage it. Better to ring in prayer, priests would say, than to let fear rule in silence. In small villages where no great bell tower stood, The people made their own music of the dead. They struck iron pots or hung small handbells above their doors, ringing them when the wind howled. Children carried tiny clappers, bone carved into shapes of doves or crosses, shaking them as they walked home from the vigil. The noise, they said, would keep the ghosts from following. Spirits disliked the sound of life. An old saying went, "They travel in silence and hunger for quiet hearts." And so the people filled the night with sound, not to drown out the dead, but to remind them that the living still had voices. The bells also marked another truth the Middle Ages could never escape: mortality. In a world of brief lives and constant death, the tolling was both elegy and education. It told children, before they could read, that life was fleeting. It reminded the strong that even kings and knights would one day lie beneath the same soil as beggars. "The bell speaks to all," wrote one monk in the 12th century, "for all must answer." At dawn, when the final toll faded, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. Birds hesitated to sing, as if afraid to interrupt. Smoke rose from the church roof, carrying the scent of wax, incense, and something deeper, the faint trace of mortality that clung to everything on this night. There were stories told in those hours before daylight, stories passed from grandmothers to children as warnings. They said that if you listened closely during the tolling, you might hear a second voice beneath the bell, a faint echo, not made by any human hand. That was the sound of the dead answering back. Some claimed it was a blessing, others a curse. "If the dead ring with the living," they whispered, "a soul has been freed or taken." Few dared to test the truth of it, but many who heard the bell swore that, for a moment, the air around them felt thinner, as though the world itself leaned closer to the next. In the larger towns, where the churches were tall and proud, the tolling became a performance of both faith and fear. Whole communities gathered in the square to listen. Children clutched their mothers' cloaks. Men bowed their heads. When the bell swung, its bronze body gleaming in torchlight, the sound rolled through the streets like thunder. Windows rattled. Dogs barked. And for a heartbeat, even time seemed to hold its breath. The monks who tended the bells took pride in their duty. Though it was grueling, the ropes grew slick with sweat, the tower stairs were steep and cold. Yet they believed that each note struck the very gates of purgatory. "The dead hear us," said one friar, "and the angels too. Every toll is a bridge." Some chroniclers recorded that in certain abbeys, the bell ringers fasted all day before the vigil, purifying themselves so that their prayers would travel farther. Still, not all bells were rung in mourning. Some were joyous. The passing bells sounded when a soul was believed to have reached heaven at last. Those tones were higher, brighter, almost triumphant. The living would smile through their tears, saying, "He has gone to the light." Yet, even in joy, there was a shiver, for each passing bell reminded them that their turn would come. In smaller parishes, where only handbells were used, the intimacy of the sound made it almost personal. The priest might walk the lanes at dusk, ringing the bell softly as he went, murmuring names of the dead. People would pause their work, bow their heads, and cross themselves. For those few moments, the whole village seemed united: cobbler, farmer, child, and widow, all bound together by a single sound that neither wealth nor distance could escape. It was in these moments that the phrase "memento mori," remember, you must die, carried its deepest weight. The bell was not meant to terrify, but to teach. To hear, it was to be reminded that life was fragile, that repentance should not wait for tomorrow. The Church, always mindful of mortality's usefulness, wove the tolling into sermons and feast days. "When you hear the bell," priests would say, "know that it rings not for others, but for you." Yet even with such solemn warnings, there was comfort in the ritual. The people found beauty in the rhythm, the certainty that no matter how dark the world became, the bell would still ring, faithful as sunrise. Its sound tied the living to the dead, the earth to heaven, grief to gratitude. It was both an ending and a promise. As night gave way to morning, frost began to bloom on rooftops and gravestones alike. The last echoes faded into the hills, but the vibration seemed to linger not in the air, but in the bones. And perhaps that was fitting, for in the medieval mind, bones were not symbols of fear but of endurance. Flesh withered, but bone endured, silent and patient beneath the soil. So too did the bells. Even when silent, They waited like skeletons of sound, ready to sing again when the world grew quiet enough to need them. In the centuries that followed, the meaning of the toll would shift. It would become a call to arms, a warning of fire, a cry of mourning during plagues and wars. But on Halloween, on that thin night between life and death, it retained its first and oldest purpose: to call the souls home, and to remind the living that they, too, walked on borrowed time. To hear the bell was to stand at the edge of eternity, to feel for one breath that the world was vast and fragile, and that within its music lay both warning and grace. The monks who rang them knew this. The peasants who listened understood it in their bones. For in the tolling of bells, in the rhythm of iron and air, they heard not only the voice of death, but the sound of what it meant to be alive. And so, when the last bell fell silent and the sun rose pale over the frost, the people did not weep. They crossed themselves, stepped back into their humble days, and whispered, "The bells have spoken, the souls have heard." Then life resumed with work to do, bread to bake, children to raise until the next year, when the night grew long again, and the bells would once more chase the spirits through the fog, echoing across the fields like the heartbeat of a world that refused to forget its dead. The bells that tolled through the night eventually faded, but in the stillness that followed, something else began to echo through the world of the Middle Ages, not a sound this time, but an image. It appeared first on the walls of churches, carved into wood, painted upon plaster, stitched into tapestries, whispered in song. It was a procession both grotesque and beautiful. Skeletons and corpses, bony hands outstretched, dancing in a long, endless line beside the living. Kings, priests, peasants, merchants, maidens, and fools, all clasped together in a strange and terrible harmony. This was the dance macabre, the dance of death. It began, as so many things in that age did, with plague. The 14th century had seen half of Europe buried under earth and ash. Entire villages vanished, and cities were left hollow as skulls. No one, no matter their wealth or holiness, could escape the black breath of the pestilence. When the living staggered out from the ruins, they found that laughter had turned brittle, faith had grown uncertain, and death had become not a visitor, but a companion. And yet, in the face of that horror, the people did what humans always do. They made art of their fear. The earliest danse macabre appeared in Paris, around 1425, painted on the walls of the cemetery of the Holy Innocents, a place where bones lay piled as high as the living. The mural showed death as a musician, leading a chain of figures from every rank of society: a bishop, a merchant, a farmer, a jester, each caught mid-step, as though surprised by the rhythm. Above them, a verse warned in Latin, "No man escapes me." The message was simple, but profound. Death is the great equalizer. In a world obsessed with hierarchy, where divine, right-crowned kings and poverty was seen as fate, the dance of death mocked it all. Here, in this macabre ballet, there were no titles, no privileges. The priest danced beside the sinner, the queen beside the prostitute, the knight beside the fool. The grave had no etiquette, and the bones beneath silk and sackcloth rattled in the same tune. It was not meant purely to terrify. Medieval people were more intimate with death than modern minds can imagine. They saw it daily in childbirth, in famine, in war. To them, the dance macabre was not morbid indulgence, but a kind of truth. It said, "Remember that life is brief, that laughter and prayer end in silence, but also that in the end, we are all companions." Still, the imagery had bite. The skeletons were not solemn but mischievous, even mocking. Some plucked lutes or played drums made of stretched skin. Others tugged at the robes of bishops or yanked the crowns off kings. Their grins were wide, eternal, and merciless. This was death not as a mournful shadow, but as a jester, the ultimate fool, dancing through the courts of the world, reminding all who watched that power and beauty were only disguises worn for a moment. It was satire, faith, and fear woven into one. The artists of the age were not gentle. They understood that laughter, even grim laughter, was a form of courage. The dance macabre spoke to a people who had learned that the world could crumble without warning, that no prayer could stop the plague, no sword could strike down the invisible. So instead of denying death, they invited it in, dressed it in humor, and let it dance through the streets. In villages, musicians and actors began to perform the dance in living form. Processions marched through town squares during feast days, men and women dressed as skeletons made of painted cloth and bone masks. They danced to the sound of flutes and drums, weaving through crowds, grabbing the hands of onlookers. The audience would cheer, then shudder, then fall silent because in the whirl of movement, everyone saw themselves reflected. The dancers would chant, "I lead the poor, I lead the proud, from cradle soft to coffin shroud. No ring, no crown can hold me fast. I take the first, I take the last." Children laughed, thinking it only a game. The elders, though, heard the sermon beneath the song. This was the medieval way of teaching theology, not through lectures, but through performance and poetry. In the dance, they saw both justice and mercy. Justice, because death treated all men equally. Mercy, because it freed them from a world of endless toil. And still, the art spread. In Lübeck, Germany, a grand mural stretched across the walls of St. Mary's Church, 30 figures, each led by a skeleton. The verses beneath each pair were like dialogue between life and death. A noble protested, "I have gold enough to build a fortress against you." Death replied, "Then build it in heaven, for your walls of stone will fall." The imagery was so vivid that visitors swore they could hear faint music when the wind moved through the nave. In England, the dance took on a darker wit. Carvers etched skeletal jesters into the margins of manuscripts, capering beside monks and knights. Poets wrote verses where death himself spoke as a court entertainer, bowing mockingly to kings and nobles. "Your Majesty," one poem began, "you may command armies, but I command silence." Even the clergy, though uneasy, saw value in the message. The dance macabre was a sermon in paint, a reminder to repent, to live humbly, to prepare one's soul. The church approved it, though it warned against taking too much pleasure in the grotesque. But people needed their grim laughter. It was their shield against despair. For peasants who could not read, the image was everything. The paintings spoke more clearly than Latin scripture. They showed that no matter how small one's life seemed, the end was shared by all. In a strange way, it gave dignity to the poor. A beggar might look upon a mural and think, "The king will dance beside me yet." It was comfort wrapped in horror, a democracy of bones. At fairs and festivals, the imagery took on life again. Minstrels sang songs of the dance macabre, plucking at lutes while masked performers twirled through the crowd. The refrain was always the same: "We all must dance." Candles flickered, casting moving shadows of bone and silk upon the walls. For a few moments, the world seemed to spin a carnival of mortality, where fear became festivity. But beneath the laughter, a quiet truth lingered. The medieval people did not dance with death because they found it amusing. They danced because they had learned that to ignore death was to let it devour you. Better to face it, to mock it, to make it part of life. The dance macabre was their way of taming the terror of turning the inevitable into art. There were whispers, too, that sometimes the dead themselves joined the dance. Travelers told of graveyards where, on Halloween night, skeletons rose from the earth, moving in silent procession toward the churchyard. Their bones clicked like beads, and faint strains of unseen music drifted through the air. Any living soul brave enough to watch might see a familiar face among them, a brother, a friend, smiling that eternal smile as he danced away into the fog. Whether these tales were born of faith, fear, or fancy, they gave the danse macabre its eternal heartbeat. It was not just a painting or performance, but a way of seeing the world, a philosophy in motion. It said that to live was to move toward death with open eyes, and to do so with a kind of grace. In the centuries to come, the image would endure. Painters of the Renaissance still borrowed its themes. Poets would write of skeletons playing violins at midnight. Even in modern times, the echo of that medieval humor remains in Halloween's laughter, in costumes that turn death into play, in the way we light candles and tell ghost stories to feel alive. For those who lived in the shadow of the plague, the dance macabre was not despair, but defiance. It was their way of saying, "You may take our flesh, but you cannot take our song." And so, when the bells stopped tolling and silence reclaimed the village, one could almost imagine that faint rhythm continuing, a whisper beneath the earth, a pulse in the bones of the world. If you listened closely, Perhaps you could hear it, the sound of 1,000 skeletons moving in time, the laughter of the dead mingling with the sighs of the living. The priest and the jester, the queen and the pauper, all joined hands in the same slow circle, a dance that had no beginning and no end. Their steps were steady, their grins unbroken, for in that dance lay the truth the Middle Ages knew better than any age since, that death is not the enemy of life, but its mirror, its rhythm, its inescapable music. And somewhere in that eternal procession, beneath the moonlight and the flickering candles, a single jester might still be laughing, his bells jingling faintly as he twirls with the skeleton of a king, whispering the oldest jest of all. In the end, my lord, we all keep the same beat. When the laughter of the danse macabre faded into the night and the last echo of bones and bells fell silent, something softer stirred in the air, a flicker of human longing that no sermon or superstition could quite extinguish. For though Halloween or All Hallows Eve was a night of ghosts and graves, it was also a night of hope. Death had been invited in politely, its lesson heard and heeded, and now the living turned, as they always did, toward life itself, toward fate, love, and the mysteries that waited in the shadows of the heart. By the time the church's bells marked midnight, the villagers had already moved from the churchyard back to their cottages. The world outside was still thick with fog, the kind that blurs the boundaries between what is and what might be. Inside, candles burned low, their light golden and trembling, casting strange shapes against the walls. This was the hour for quieter magic, not the holy kind of monks and priests, but the folk magic whispered from grandmother to granddaughter, carried like embers through the centuries. For the people of the Middle Ages, Halloween was not only a time to remember the dead, but to divine the living's future. The same thin veil that allowed spirits to wander was believed to make fate more visible. Love, after all, was the one mystery that rivaled death, and if the dead could cross over on this night, perhaps destiny could too. Young maidens, their hair unbraided and faces lit by candlelight, gathered in kitchens and barns, giggling like children though their voices trembled with nerves. They came not to summon ghosts, but to catch a glimpse of the men who might one day share their hearth. The ritual was simple, yet sacred in its own way. An apple symbol of temptation, knowledge, and life itself would be peeled in one long, unbroken strip. The girl would stand before a mirror or a bowl of still water, turning slowly, and then toss the peel over her shoulder. When it fell, its shape was said to reveal the initial of her future husband's name. Some claimed it worked best in silence. Others whispered a short rhyme as they turned. By light of moon and flame of fire, show the name of my heart's desire. And though most of the time the peel landed in meaningless curls, once in a while by luck or illusion it did seem to form a letter. The girls would gasp, their faces flushing, the candlelight catching the gleam of possibility in their eyes. The room would fill with laughter, part joy, part fear, because love, like death, was unpredictable, and both could change a life overnight. Apples held a strange power on Halloween. Long before Christian feast days, they had been symbols of rebirth in Celtic lore. To bite one, or gaze into water where they floated, was to look into the mystery of fate itself. So, another custom took shape, one that still lingers in modern times: apple bobbing. But in its earliest form, it was no children's game. It was an act of divination. Bowls were filled with water drawn from the village well, cold and pure. Apples were set afloat, each one marked secretly with the name or token of a suitor. A girl would kneel, hands behind her back, and try to catch an apple using only her teeth. The first one she caught would reveal her destined match. The water reflected her face as she leaned over it, and for an instant, she might have wondered whether she was seeing herself or her future. The air would fill with shrieks and laughter, droplets flying as someone splashed too hard or bit into another's apple by mistake. The merriment was genuine, but beneath it pulsed something older, something pagan and primal, the belief that the world, just for this night, was alive with answers, if one dared to ask the right questions. In the corner, older women watched with faint smiles. They remembered their own youth, their own nights of candlelight and whispered wishes. Yet their eyes were wary, for such rituals were frowned upon by the church. The priest had warned against divinations of the heart. Leave the future to God, they said. But love was not so easily banished, nor was curiosity. And so, like the hidden fires of Samhain that still burned beneath Christian prayers, these secret games endured. There were other charms, more daring, more dangerous. One of the most famous was the nut test, practiced by couples or hopeful lovers. A fire would be built upon the hearth, its embers glowing red. Two nuts, usually hazelnuts or chestnuts, were placed side by side upon the iron grate, each named for a person. The watchers leaned close, eyes fixed on the tiny flames. If the nuts burned quietly together, it was a sign that love would endure steady, faithful, and warm. But if one popped or rolled away, it foretold discord, betrayal, or parting. The crackle of the shell became the voice of destiny itself. Lovers laughed nervously, pretending not to care, but everyone listened for the verdict of the fire. Some even tossed in a third nut for the rival, just to see whose flame would last. There were countless variations of these rites across Europe. In Scotland, girls ate a salty cake before bed without drinking water, hoping to dream of a man who would bring them a drink, the one destined to be their husband. In Ireland, they boiled a culcannon, a dish of cabbage and potatoes, hiding small tokens inside: a ring for marriage, a coin for fortune, a thimble for spinsterhood. Whoever found the ring would soon wed. Whoever found the thimble might sigh and serve herself another spoonful. Even the men had their games, though less poetic and more boastful. Some wagered on which maiden's apple peel would spell their name. Others mocked the divinations altogether, until the one they secretly fancied looked at them across the firelight, her cheeks glowing with the reflection of flame. Then their laughter softened, and they listened a little too closely to the popping of the nuts. These customs, harmless on the surface, carried deeper meaning. They were the village's way of balancing life against death. After a night spent remembering the departed, it was natural to seek comfort in the living. The same fire that purified cattle and guarded souls from the dark now served to warm young hearts and ignite dreams of love. Halloween, in the medieval imagination, was a circle death on one edge, desire on the other, both meeting in the glow of the same flame. And though the church would later condemn these superstitions as pagan remnants, even the priests must have understood. After all, love and mortality were twin sermons. Both taught humility. Both demanded faith. The young sought answers from apples and ashes because no priest could promise them the one thing they most desired, that they would not be alone. Sometimes, of course, the line between play and prayer blurred. A maiden might whisper her crush's name as she crossed herself, "In God's grace, may he be true." Another might murmur the Lord's Prayer backward, a dangerous act. Some said to summon a vision of her future husband's face in the mirror. If she saw a shadow instead, it meant he would die before their wedding. Few dared to look twice. The charm of such rituals was not only in belief, but in the hope they offered. In an age where lives were short and marriages often arranged, these moments of choice of personal magic felt intoxicating. For one night a year, even peasants could glimpse control over fate. Outside, the fog thickened again, curling around the thatched roofs. Dogs howled, owls called from the forest. But inside the cottages, the light of human longing burned bright. Girls tucked their apple peels under pillows, whispering the rhyme that would make their dreams prophetic. Boys threw another log on the fire, pretending to laugh as their own nuts popped apart. The old women muttered that the young were foolish, and yet, when no one was watching, they too tossed a coin into the fire for luck. Because even in a world shadowed by death, famine, and plague, people still reached for hope. They always have. By the time dawn began to pale the windows, the games were done. The apples were gone. The fire reduced to embers. The air heavy with the scent of smoke and cider. Some slept, dreaming of faces they had never seen before. Others stayed awake, staring at the ashes, wondering if what they'd glimpsed in the flames had been a promise or a warning. And when morning came, All Saints' Day, they would rise, attend Mass, and kneel in quiet reverence. The priest would speak of holiness, of heaven, of salvation, but beneath the hymns and incense, the villagers would still think of apple peels and burning nuts, of laughter and longing, of how thin the line truly was between love and faith, between superstition and prayer. For that was the secret of medieval Halloween. Beneath the fear of death lay the ache to live, to love, to know what tomorrow might bring. The fires of Samhain had not died. They had simply changed shape, no longer burning on the hills to ward off spirits, but glowing quietly in hearths and hearts. And perhaps that was the truest spell of all. Not one cast with words or charms, but with hope itself, the belief that even in the darkest night, the heart still dares to ask for love, and the universe, for a moment, dares to answer. By the time the last apple peel had fallen to the floor and the final ember had sighed itself into ash, the first light of dawn began to creep through the fog. It came quietly, like a soft apology, after a long night of whispers. The horizon turned pale gray, the kind of color that felt neither alive nor dead, somewhere in between, like the souls that had wandered the earth just hours before. Cocks crowed from distant farms, and the village, so alive with laughter and shadows the night before, now stirred in weary silence. The fires that had once roared on the hills were reduced to faint orange eyes, blinking out one by one. The smell of smoke still lingered, mingling with the damp breath of the fields. The world looked tired, as if it, too, had kept vigil through the long, haunted hours of All Hallows' Eve. Inside the cottages, candles had burned themselves down to puddles of wax. Masks, crude things made of soot and straw, of bone and hide, hung limp by the doorways, their grins now meaningless in the daylight. The children who had worn them the night before slept deeply, tangled in their blankets, safe again in the land of the living. The laughter, the fear, the stories, all of it seemed to dissolve with the fog as the morning took hold. For in the medieval mind, dawn was not just another part of the day. It was salvation. It was proof that the world had survived the night, that the restless dead had been appeased, that the veil between worlds had closed once more. The dead had returned to their graves, and the living to their prayers. The bells began again, but this time their tones were different. Not the slow, mournful tolling of All Souls' Eve, but a brighter, prouder peal. It was All Saints' Day now, the feast of the holy, the celebration of those souls who had already reached paradise. The church, ever wise in timing, had built this day as a balm for the night that came before. The villagers, still shaken by dreams of spirits and flickering lights, now turned their steps toward the sound of salvation. The path to the chapel was muddy from last night's mist. Cloaked figures walked in silence, their breath clouding the air. They carried offerings, loaves of bread, small candles, sometimes even coins to lay before the altar. In their faces lingered traces of exhaustion, but also a quiet peace. They had faced the darkness, honored the dead, and now it was time to look toward heaven. Inside the small stone church, the air was warm with candlelight. The priest's voice rose and fell like waves against the walls. He spoke of saints and martyrs, of those who had fought the good fight and earned their eternal rest. He spoke, too, of the living, reminding them that to walk in faith was to walk toward that same light. His Latin words rolled through the nave, ancient and strange, but comforting all the same. Outside, the morning light grew stronger, filtering through the stained glass and painting soft halos upon bowed heads. For a moment, the villagers forgot the cold. Forgotten were the ghost stories, the fears of witches and spirits, the superstitions whispered under moonlight. All that remained was the hum of human voices, the mingling of incense and prayer, the sense that life, fragile though it was, still went on. When the service ended, people lingered outside the churchyard. Some crossed themselves before the graves of their ancestors. Others simply stood, gazing at the world as though it had been remade. The dew sparkled on the grass, and the air smelled clean, almost holy. The fear of the night before seemed foolish now, like a nightmare fading with the dawn. But there were always those who remembered differently, the old women who claimed they had heard voices in the wind, the children who swore they had seen figures moving in the fog. They would whisper to each other, quietly, as the day went on. Best not to speak of it too loud, one might say. The dead don't like to be remembered in daylight. And yet even they knew. The veil was closed again. Whatever had crossed over in the night was gone, or at least waiting. The fires had burned their final embers, sealing the boundary between the worlds. The offerings of bread and milk had been taken, or perhaps eaten by the village dogs. Either way, the gesture had been made, and that was what mattered. By midday, life had resumed. Farmers led their oxen back into the fields. Housewives kneaded dough, their hands white with flour. The market square filled again with voices, though softer than usual, as if everyone still feared to speak too loudly. Children played near the wells, tossing pebbles and laughing, their masks forgotten. And above it all, the sun, pale but insistent, burned away the last traces of mist. Yet in every corner of that medieval village, in every heart that had stayed awake through the long October night, there remained a quiet awareness. They had made it through another turning of the year. Halloween was not merely a festival, it was a threshold. Beyond it lay winter long, cruel and uncertain. Beyond it lay hunger, illness, and cold. But for now, they had survived the night when death had walked beside them. Some traditions still lingered through the day. In certain villages, families shared what they called soul loaves, small round breads baked with spice and marked with a cross. Each loaf eaten was said to release a soul from purgatory. In other places, children carried baskets from door to door, collecting bits of food in exchange for reciting short prayers. Though the church called it charity, the villagers knew it for what it was, a softer echo of the night before, a continuation of souling. The world, it seemed, never truly let go of its ghosts. It only learned to name them differently. As the sun set on November 1st, the mood was solemn, but no longer fearful. The villagers gathered for a modest meal, the last of the harvest vegetables, a bit of pork if fortune had been kind. The fire burned low and steady, no longer a ward against spirits, but a simple comfort against the cold. Children dozed beside their parents, the glow of the flames painting soft light on their faces. And when the priest passed by, blessing the homes, he smiled. The night's danger had passed. The world was safe again for now. Outside, the fields lay quiet, rimed with frost. The sky was clear, the stars distant and sharp. Somewhere, an owl called a reminder that the dark still watched, still waited, but the people no longer feared it. They knew that the veil was sealed, that the restless souls had returned to their own realm, guided by candles, soothed by prayers, and satisfied by offerings. The living, too, could rest easy. There was comfort in the rhythm of it all, the cycle of fear and faith, of darkness and dawn. Halloween had been endured, just as it had been the year before, and would be again the next. It was the pulse of life itself, the endless dance between death and renewal. As night fell once more, a different kind of silence descended. Not the uneasy hush of Halloween, but the peace that comes after storms. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and rain. The stars shone like cold coins scattered across the heavens. And somewhere far away, perhaps in another village, another priest was ringing the bells for Compline, the night prayer, a final note to close the holy day. Those who listened might have felt a small stirring in their hearts, not fear, but gratitude. For another year, the world remained whole. The fires were out, the masks hung up, the souls at rest. And yet, deep beneath the calm, a whisper endured, ancient, cyclical, inevitable. It said that the veil would thin again, as it always did, that when the harvests were done and the nights grew long, the living and the dead would meet once more in shadow and flame. But that was far away. For now, the world belonged to the living, and as the first frost of November settled upon the fields, the village slept the dead in their graves, the living in their beds, both bound by the same rhythm of silence and time. The fires had burned low, the masks were put away, the prayers had been said, the year had turned, the veil had sealed, and life fragile, stubborn, and shining began again. Until next Halloween, the fires have long since faded. The air, once thick with smoke and whispered prayers, is calm again. The mist that clung to the thatched rooftops has lifted, and in its place lies silence, the kind that feels like a sigh after centuries of breath. The villagers are gone now, their cottages long turned to dust, their fields reclaimed by grass and stone. But the memory of their night, that long, trembling vigil between the living and the dead, still lingers, like a faint ember refusing to die. Halloween, for them, was never about horror or play. It was about survival. It was a night to remember those who had gone before, to honor them, to fear them just enough to stay humble before the mysteries of the world. It was the story of people who lived close to the soil, to hunger, to faith people who feared the dark but faced it anyway, because they had no other choice. They lit their fires not to frighten, but to endure. They whispered their charms not to summon evil, but to keep it at bay. They looked into the darkness and saw both danger and comfort, both the end and the beginning. To live through a medieval Halloween was to stand on the edge of two worlds, the known and the unknowable, and to hope that when the night was over, the dawn would return. And though the centuries have swept them away, the echo of their courage remains. The old bonfires that once burned atop the hills are now candles glowing inside carved pumpkins. The bread they baked for souls has turned into sweet confections traded by children at doorsteps. The masks they wore to confuse the dead have become costumes worn for laughter. The customs have changed shape, softened by time and comfort, yet the heartbeat beneath them is the same, a pulse that says, "We are still here, and we are still afraid of the dark, but we will light our fire anyway." The medieval soul understood something we often forget, that fear and faith are sisters. That laughter, even nervous laughter, is an act of defiance against the unknown. To tell ghost stories, to light candles, to remember the dead, these were not childish games. They were rituals of endurance. They were humanity's way of saying to death, "You may walk beside us tonight, but you will not have us yet." So, tonight, as you listen wherever you are, in the quiet of your room or under the hum of city lights, close your eyes for a moment. Imagine that faraway village. Picture the hills dark against the starlit sky. See the glow of bonfires flickering in the wind. The villagers gathered close, their faces bright with hope and fear. Hear the bells toll faintly from the church tower, the sound drifting like a prayer into the night. And beyond them, in the fog, in the shadows between the trees, imagine the soft shapes of the old souls walking home, their journey across the veil nearly done. The world is silent again for now. But Halloween was never about endings. It was about remembering, about the circle that never breaks life, death, and the brief fire that burns between. And perhaps, if you listen closely enough, you'll feel it too, that gentle shiver, that sense that you are not entirely alone. Because somewhere, in the dark beyond your window, the old spirits of Halloween still walk. They move slowly, smiling softly at the living who have forgotten their names, watching as we light our small, fragile fires, candles in pumpkins, lanterns in hands, trying, as they once did, to hold back the night. So before you drift to sleep, take a breath. Feel the warmth of the world around you, the heartbeat that still endures. Remember that you, too, are part of that unbroken chain. One more flicker in the long story of firelight and shadow. And if you've enjoyed wandering back through history tonight, through fear, through faith, through the quiet beauty of the past, don't forget to keep that fire burning. Leave a like if this tale stirred something in you. Share it if you wish to pass the story forward. And subscribe if you want to travel again to more forgotten nights, more ancient fires, more echoes of the human heart. For now, let the world rest. The veil is sealed, the candles burn low, the spirits sleep. Good night, and happy Halloween.